At the Field of Fire, 4,500 soldiers burned alive in a single afternoon. Not defeated in battle, burned. And after this afternoon, 6 of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros simply knelt. Not because they lacked armies, because they lacked the will to become ash. Let your breathing slow. Whatever held you taut during the day can be placed in the other room now, alongside everything that will wait until morning. Tonight we are going back further than any story you know by name, past the familiar wars and the marriages made in throne rooms and the swords drawn in the dark, all the way to the moment before the shape of Westeros was fixed. You are somewhere still and held now. Whatever is beneath you is solid and warm. The sounds around you, whatever they happen to be, can become, if you allow them, the cold rhythm of the narrow sea working against volcanic rock in the long dark. On an island in the middle of that grey water, 3 young people are watching a continent and quietly deciding what to do about it. The year, by a calendar that has not yet been invented, is approximately the year 298 before the Conquest. That phrase, before the Conquest, only makes sense from the other side of what it names. The way all turning points in history only become legible in retrospect. Right now, it is simply a year like any other on the surface, though beneath the surface, something enormous is gathering itself. On Dragonstone, a young man with silver-gold hair and eyes of deep violet is sitting in a stone room that smells of salt water and old minerals, watching the western horizon through a window so narrow it lets in more wind than light. His name is Aegon. He is 27 years old. The dream he has carried since childhood concerns the end of the world. Dragonstone is cold in a way that settles into you. The wind off the narrow sea works through every gap in the volcanic stone, which is everywhere dark and rough, carrying a trace of latent warmth that makes it feel paradoxical to the touch. A stone that remembers fire, living in the cold. The castle was built in the Valyrian style, which is to say it was not built so much as grown. Walls shaped from the island's own material by sorceries that died with the freehold. Towers tapering into dragon forms at their peaks. The structure sitting on the headland as though it had emerged from the rock rather than been placed upon it. The smell inside is salt and old minerals and something that almost becomes sulphur. The sound at night is the sea and the wind doing ancient and indifferent business with each other. It is not a comfortable place to live. It is an excellent place to cultivate conviction. The Targaryens had been here for over a century before Aegon was born. They came because a woman named Rhaenys, called the Dreamer in the family stories, which were the way this family kept its history in the absence of a citadel willing to keep it for them, had seen in her sleep the destruction of old Valyria 12 years before it arrived. She saw the 14 fires of the Valyrian peninsula erupting simultaneously. She saw the land tearing itself apart, the sea rushing in, the cities that had stood for 5,000 years consumed in a single morning. She told her father, Aegon Targaryen, what she had seen, in enough specific and verifiable detail that he believed her. Aegon sold the family's Valyrian holdings. He gathered their 5 dragons and their household and their portable memory of who they were. He moved them west, to this cold and unremarkable island at the edge of the Valyrian world. Then he waited to see if the dream was true. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. 12 years later, the doom came exactly as Rhaenys had described it, and the scholars who have studied the Smoking Sea in the centuries since have never produced a satisfying explanation of what actually occurred. The 14 fires did not erupt sequentially, as geological events proceed according to any model the natural world has produced. They erupted simultaneously. This is not how volcanoes behave, which is why theories about the doom tend to accumulate elements of the uncanny even in the mouths of meisters who would prefer to remain empirical. The Valyrian peninsula collapsed. The sea boiled where it filled in. The cities of 5,000 years, some of the largest, oldest, most sophisticated human structures ever produced, were consumed in hours. Every other Dragonlord family died. Every other bloodline of the Freehold ended. The Targaryens alone, on their cold island, continued to exist. Sit with that for a moment, as your body settles and your breathing finds its natural depth. The greatest civilization the world had ever produced, 5,000 years old, spanning a continent, having bent dragons to human service and built roads that subsequent civilizations would excavate and marvel at for centuries, was gone in a single day. Not declined, not conquered, not slowly absorbed into something larger. Gone. The Valyrian Peninsula is still called the Smoking Sea, on every map made since, because it still smokes, because the geological memory of what burned beneath it is still legible in the landscape. The libraries ended, the lineages ended, the accumulated sorcery of millennia became inaccessible overnight, like a library whose only copy of every book has burned. And the Targaryens, on their cold island, remained. The last, the only. This is not, as the cleaner versions of this history tend to frame it, simply a tale of fortunate timing. The Targaryen survival was the foundation of their entire self-understanding. And that self-understanding shaped everything about the conquest that followed. They carried in their bloodlines the biological capacity for dragon bonding that Valyrian breeding practices had cultivated across dozens of generations. They carried in their memory, imperfectly filtered through a century of oral transmission on a cold island, but still present, still alive, the culture and worldview and accumulated wisdom of the Freehold. They were not simply a noble family with dragons. They were the last fragment of something that had been the defining fact of their world, now asked to exist in a world that had moved past what they represented. When Aegon crossed the water, he brought all of this with him. What Aegon inherited, along with the 3 dragons and the cold castle and the small loyal household, was a dream that had been passed down through 4 generations of Targaryens. Like all stories that travel through that many minds and that many years, it had changed with each telling. Some elements sharpened, some softened, the core preserved with the particular care that families reserve for the stories they understand to be about who they actually are. The dream was called The Song of Ice and Fire, and Aegon confided its contents only to his sisters. The maesters of the Citadel would not learn of it for nearly 3 centuries, until Queen Alysanne brought it to them, which is itself a measure of how carefully the secret was kept, and how seriously the keeping was taken. In the dream, as Aegon described it, a long night came from beyond the wall at the top of the world. Armies of the dead moved through that winter, south through the dark, into a Westeros that could not coordinate a response. 7 kingdoms each looked to their own borders first. Each king held back the resources that a common defense would require, waiting to see what the others would sacrifice before committing his own. The dead moved through their hesitation, the way cold moves through a house where the fire has gone out. Not quickly, not spectacularly, but steadily, filling every space that warmth has vacated. Aegon saw this clearly. He saw the solution equally clearly. 1 kingdom, 1 authority with the power to compel unified action. 1 army at the wall that actually meant it. He saw this with the absolute clarity of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. Then he went and built it. What gave this vision the weight of obligation rather than the weight of ambition? What converted it from something Aegon wanted to do into something he understood he had to do? Was the precedent Rhaenys had set. She had seen the doom. Her father had believed her. The family had survived. Everyone who had not believed, everyone who had not acted, was ash and sediment beneath the smoking sea. For 3 generations, the Targaryens had lived with the visceral knowledge that a willingness to trust a prophetic vision was literally the difference between their existence and their extinction. When Aegon had his own vision of catastrophe, the family history did not leave room for deliberation. You act completely, and you act before the event you are trying to prevent has produced the evidence that would convince skeptics, because by the time the evidence arrives, the time for prevention has already closed. The instrument of all of this was Balerion the Black Dread, and that name deserves more than the quick mention it tends to receive in histories moving toward more dramatic material. Balerion was already over a century old when Aegon rode him across the narrow sea, the last living being to have flown over old Valyria while it still stood, the last breathing remnant of a world that existed only in memory and the geological scar of the smoking sea. His wingspan was not meaningfully comparable to any subsequent dragons. It existed in a different category entirely. His fire burned black at its edges and red only at its core, hot enough to liquefy stone so quickly that the liquid ran and fused into new shapes as it cooled. When he used it, the world changed in permanent ways. He was not a weapon so much as a geological force that happened to have a rider. He was the end of an argument. He was the last sentence of a debate that had gone on too long. Visenya rode Vhagar, and Visenya herself was the element of the conquest that no different person could have provided. She was 2 years older than her brother-husband, and in every practical military sense his equal, and in some respects his superior. Though Aegon was wise enough to depend on her judgment, without the kind of insecurity that such dependence often produces in men of ambition. She wore armor, as other noble women wore their finest clothes, not as a statement, not as a challenge, but as what fit her, as the natural covering for a body that understood itself best in that configuration. Dark Sister, her Valyrian steel blade, had been made for a woman's hand. This was not incidental. It was the most precise expression of what Visenya was, not an imitation of a male warrior, but her own distinct thing, complete and self-consistent. She rode Vhagar with the cold patience of someone who understood that arriving at a conclusion efficiently is more important than arriving at it dramatically. Rhaenys, the youngest of the three, rode Meraxes, large and powerful, and possessed of a leonine ease in flight that seemed to mirror her rider's own ease with herself and with the world. Rhaenys understood something about rule that Aegon knew intellectually, but that she felt as practice. Fire can take a country, but cannot keep it. Loyalty sustained through fear is always watching for the moment when fear relaxes, and that moment always comes. Loyalty, earned through genuine regard, through the sense that the ruler understands what the ruled value and makes an effort to protect it, is something more durable and more worth building. She was the one who sat with lords' families after the knee was bent, who remembered children's names, who asked about harvests and local disputes, and the particular concerns that fill a life not primarily organized around geopolitics. She made the politically inevitable feel personally real. The conquest would have been a military achievement without her. It became something more durable because of the work she did that the chronicles don't record. Together, the three of them constituted an argument that the conquest presented to every lord and king it encountered. Visenya's argument was the mathematics of the situation. This is happening, and the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of submission. Aegon's argument was the necessity of the thing. This is happening because it must, for reasons larger than any one person's ambition. And Rhaenys' argument was the one no military conquest usually bothers to make, that what comes after the conquest might actually be worth living in. Each of these arguments was necessary. None was sufficient without the others. The lords who bent the knee earliest were generally those who heard all three simultaneously, who felt the weight of the dragons and the certainty of the purpose and the warmth of the promise about what they were being asked to join. Fear alone builds a resentful empire. The conquest built something more complicated than that. And for that complexity, Rhaenys deserves the credit she rarely receives. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. There's a straight line of inheritance, not metaphorical but biological, running through blood rather than legend. Between these three people on Dragonstone and Daenerys Targaryen, standing on a different Dragonstone shore 3 centuries later, looking west at a continent she believes is hers by right and by prophecy. She carries the dream in the same blood. She carries the characteristic Targaryen certainty that what she wants and what the world needs are the same thing, which is this family's most distinctive quality and its most dangerous one. She contains all 3 of her ancestors: Rhaenys' warmth and genuine capacity for human connection, Aegon's prophetic urgency and his absolute sense of purpose, Visenya's cold efficiency when the moment turns mund and warmth is no longer what the situation requires. The question her story poses, the question the series circles without entirely settling, is which of those 3 she is, in any given moment of pressure. The answer is probably all 3. And that is precisely the problem. Jon Snow does not know his name is Aegon Targaryen. He does not know that he is, in the language his ancestor would have recognized, the literal answer to the Song of Ice and Fire. Ice in his mother's Stark blood, and fire in his father's Targaryen inheritance. The long and winding project of 3 centuries of Targaryen history arriving without fanfare, in a young man raised in Winterfell who believes himself to be a bastard. He grew up with every understanding of himself, built on a foundation he doesn't know the shape of. But when he stands on the wall in the long watches of the night and looks north into the permanent dark and feels something there, not as a thought, not as a visible thing, but as a pressure. The way a coming storm makes itself known in the body before it makes itself known in the sky. What he is feeling is the prophetic tradition of his bloodline, still functional after 300 years, still pointing north, still saying, "There, that is what you were made to stand against. Let those thoughts become still. The names can blur at their edges. The lineages can soften into impression. What remains, as you breathe slowly, and the room becomes simply warm and dark, is the image of an island in a cold sea, 3 dragons breathing in volcanic stone beneath a castle, and a western horizon where everything that follows is still only a possibility. The throne has not yet been built. The dynasty has not yet begun. The fire is still contained within its own potential. For this moment, let everything remain as it is, unresolved, unhurried, held in the amber of the moment before it all began. The history will keep. Your watch for this hour is ended. Sleep well, and let the narrow sea carry the weight of centuries gently away. But across the water, the world that Aegon proposed to claim was already ancient and complicated in its own right. 7 kingdoms, each with its own deep history of how a people and a land had grown into each other over thousands of years. Before we cross with Aegon, before the shadow of Balerion falls over the first Westerosi shore, it is worth knowing what he was sailing toward. You are still resting. Let that be the simple, sufficient fact of this moment. You are resting, and the dark is gentle, and there is no hurry here. We left Dragonstone with a question hanging in the air. What was Westeros in the years before the fire came? It is a question worth answering slowly, because the continent Aegon proposed to take was not a blank canvas. It was a world already ancient by any measure, already dense with its own particular histories and resentments and ways of understanding what the land beneath its feet meant. To understand what the conquest cost and what it built, you need to first understand what it replaced. The continent of Westeros stretched from the hot deserts of Dorne in the south to the frozen wilderness beyond the Wall in the north, and across that enormous span it contained 7 distinct kingdoms, each with its own climate and culture and economy and way of raising a child to understand what loyalty and land and honor were supposed to mean. They had been fighting with each other in various configurations and with varying degrees of intensity for the better part of 3,000 years. Not continuously, there were truces and marriages and decades of relative quiet. But the direction of travel across the long span of history was always back to war. They were 7 kingdoms in the way that 7 siblings are a family, bound together by proximity and shared origin, shaped most profoundly by their conflicts with each other, incapable of existing without reference to one another. The north was the largest of the 7 kingdoms by area, sprawling enough to swallow several of the southern realms whole, and still have room left. And it was, precisely because of that vastness, the least densely populated, and therefore, in the cold mathematics of political power, less threatening than its size might suggest. Torrhen Stark ruled from Winterfell, as Starks had ruled for 8,000 years in the tradition of the first men whose unbroken descendants they were. They kept the old gods. The weirwood trees in the godswood of Winterfell, pale-barked, blood-leaved witnesses. Their carved faces, carrying expressions that defied simple interpretation, stood as they had stood since before. The Andals brought their 7-pointed star south of the neck. The North remembered in the specific way that cold, isolated places remember. Deeply, slowly, without the urgency that comes from being crowded. Its people were hard, and its king was legitimate in ways that the South had largely forgotten how to be. The Iron Islands are worth pausing over, because their situation captures something essential about the pre-conquest world. Harren the Black, Harrenhal, called the Black for what people understood to be the colour of his soul rather than simply his appearance, had spent the past 40 years building Harrenhal on the banks of the God's Eye. And this fact alone tells you most of what you need to know about the condition of Westeros before the dragons came. Harrenhal was an act of vanity so extreme that it had crossed the border into something approaching a kind of architectural madness. Towers that were designed to touch the clouds, halls large enough to accommodate things that Harren did not possess, and had apparently not considered the implications of desiring. He ruled the Iron Islands and, by conquest, the Riverlands, a territory vast and a treasury depleted by the building, and he sat in his unfinished castle and called himself the greatest king in Westeros, which was perhaps true by one narrow measure, and deeply false by every other. The Reach was prosperous the way that fertile places with benign climates and no immediate enemies become prosperous, genuinely, comfortably, and with a tendency to confuse comfort with permanence. House Gardner had been kings in the Reach since the Age of Heroes, tracing their lineage to Garth Greenhand himself, the mythic figure who had taught the first men to cultivate the rich southern soil. By the time of Aegon's conquest, the Gardners had been kings for longer than any other royal house in Westeros. They sat on the oaken seat, a throne grown from a living oak tree, according to a Greenhand tradition, and ruled the most fertile and most densely populated kingdom on the continent. Their armies were the largest in Westeros by a considerable margin. Their granaries were the fullest. And they had, at that moment, no particular reason to think that any of this was about to change. The Westerlands had been Lannister country for 3 centuries, and in those 3 centuries the Lannisters had become the kind of family whose identity has fused so completely with its geographic inheritance that separating the two is almost impossible to imagine. They were the gold of Casterly Rock, the deep veins running through the hills above Lannisport, the wealth that made their military power possible, and their pride something more than simple arrogance. King Loren the First Lannister was not, by any contemporary measure, a particularly bad king. He was a proud one, and a capable one, and he had maintained his kingdom's independence and prestige through military strength and strategic alliances for decades. He would make one catastrophic tactical error, He would look at Aegon's crossing and see an opportunity to eliminate a threat rather than an inevitability to negotiate. That error would cost House Gardner everything, and cost House Lannister a great deal. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. The Stormlands were exactly what their name implied, a coastline battered by the temperamental weather of Shipbreaker Bay, a landscape that produced people with a deeply personal relationship to endurance, and a cultural tradition that tended to celebrate stubbornness as a virtue. Argilac Durrandon ruled them, Argilac the Arrogant, the last Storm King, and his title captures both what he was and what history thought of him. He had fought his way to the summit of his kingdom's respect through personal bravery in a series of border conflicts, and he wore his reputation with the confidence of someone who has never encountered a problem that bravery alone could not solve. He would be the first major king to challenge Aegon directly, and the first to fall. The Vale sat behind the natural walls of the Mountains of the Moon with a pride that was perhaps justified by geography, and was certainly indulged by it. The Eyrie, the castle perched at the top of a mountain, accessible only by three-way castles and a very determined climb, was simply very difficult to take by conventional military force, and the awareness of this had given the Arryns a certain quality of relaxed confidence in their own security that occasionally tipped into complacency. The child king Ronald Arryn sat on the throne at the time of the Conquest, young enough that his mother served as regent, and young enough that when a dragon landed in his courtyard, he reacted with the uncomplicated wonder of a child, rather than the complicated terror of a king. That response would turn out to be exactly the right one, though Ronel could not have known it. And then there was Dorne, different from the other kingdoms in ways that went beyond the political and the geographic, though the geographic was itself profound. The desert in the south and the Red Mountains as a natural barrier had given Dorne an isolation that preserved cultural traditions brought by the Rhoynar migration 300 years before the Conquest. Princess Meria Martell, not a queen but a princess, because Dorne followed the Rhoynar tradition of equal inheritance regardless of gender, ruled from Sunspear with the particular confidence of someone who has never been successfully invaded. Dorne had repelled every attempt to take it by military force for 300 years. The sand and the sun and the shortage of water were more effective than any army. Meria knew this. She would shortly demonstrate it in a way that changed the Conquest narrative entirely. It is worth sitting with the shape of this world for a moment before it changes. 7 kingdoms, each with its own deep logic, each with its own understanding of what the land beneath its feet meant and what surrendering sovereignty would cost. What they shared, beneath all the differences, was an inability to trust each other that had been built up over 3,000 years of conflict and accumulated grievance. The Reach and the Westerlands had fought over the reach of their respective influence for generations. The Stormlands and Dorne had ground against each other along the Dornish marches, in a border conflict that had been going on so long that some of the families involved had forgotten what the original dispute concerned. The North and the Iron Islands had fought over the contested geography of the Northwest in a series of wars that had resolved nothing and taken a great deal. These kingdoms could not unite. The structure of their mutual suspicion was too deeply grooved. The Riverlands deserve a specific moment of attention, because their situation captures better than any other region the dysfunction of the pre-conquest world. The Riverlands were neither an independent kingdom nor a willing province of anything else. They had been conquered by the Iron Islands 3 generations before Aegon's crossing, when Harren's father and grandfather extended their dominion east and inland from their island base. The River Lords, House Tully of Riverrun, House Mallister of Seaguard, House Bracken of Stonehenge, and House Blackwood of Raventree Hall, and all the others whose names will recur through everything that follows, were subjects of a king they despised, ruling in the tradition of a culture they found alien and incomprehensible. They were waiting. They had been waiting for a generation, with the patient exhaustion of people who have no other choice, for something to change. When Aegon's ravens arrived bearing his terms, the River Lords were the first to see possibility in them. They had the least to lose, and the most to gain from any alternative to what they already had. House Gardener stands at the heart of what is most tragic about the pre-conquest world, not because they were the most sympathetic of the Seven Kingdoms, but because they were the one that would simply cease to exist. The Starks would survive, the Lannisters and the Arryns, and what would become the Baratheons would all continue in some form, changed and constrained by what the conquest imposed, but still present in the world, still maintaining the thread of their family continuity. The Gardeners would not. The oldest royal house in Westeros, a line of kings that could trace its legitimate claim back to the Age of Heroes, to Garth Greenhand and the first cultivation of the southern soil, would be complete after the Field of Fire. The oaken seat would be empty. The green hand that had been the symbol of the Reach for 4,000 years would become a historical artifact rather than a living standard. History has a particular weight when a thing that lasted 4,000 years ends in an afternoon. There is a collective exhaustion that settles over a world that has been at war with itself for too long. The Westerosi lords who received Aegon's ravens, the simple terms, bend the knee, acknowledge Targaryen authority, and your seat is yours and your house continues, were not, most of them, stupid or unusually proud. They were tired. 3,000 years of conflict had produced a landed class that understood war intimately and was not romantic about it. They knew the accounting, the names of the dead on the walls of their family septs, the decades required to rebuild after a burning, the generations needed to raise population back to what it had been before the last war, and the one before that. When Aegon's terms arrived, many of the smaller lords found the proposition less offensive than it might have seemed in more comfortable times. Every noble house in the main series, every identity that defines the characters we know, was forged in this pre-conquest landscape, and carries the marks of that formation into the present. The Starks are what they are because of 8,000 years of northern isolation, the weirwood traditions, the long memory of the first men, and the specific austerity that the North's climate imposes on everyone who stays there long enough to become it. When Ned Stark says the words mean something because they have meant the same thing for 8,000 years. And the cold and the distance have made them impossible to outgrow. The Lannisters are what they are because of 300 years of gold and pride, and the particular arrogance of a family that has been powerful long enough to begin to confuse power with virtue. The gold of Casterly Rock will not last forever. This is a thing the Lannisters always know and never quite believe. Argilac the Arrogant, last king of the Stormlands, would be killed in personal combat by Orys Baratheon, and from that death a dynasty would be born. House Baratheon would inherit the seat and the words of House Durrandon. Ours is the Fury, Storm's End. The Durrandon words are Baratheon words now, carved in Baratheon stone, but the stone was built by Durrandon hands, in the Durrandon tradition, for a Durrandon purpose. Robert Baratheon, who would eventually bring down the Targaryen dynasty 300 years after its founding, sat on a throne built from the bones of a house that the Conquest had absorbed. Every inheritance in this world is built on something the inheritor did not create. Every house sits on a foundation that belongs, in some sense, to someone else. This is not an accident of history. It is the structure of history. It is how time works. Let those 7 kingdoms rest in your mind for a moment, not as a political problem requiring solution, but simply as an image. 7 lands, each with its own weather and its own way of holding a history. They were about to be changed, not destroyed. Most of them would survive, altered in their sovereignty, but continuous in their culture and their family lines and their deep local identities. They were about to be woven into something that had not existed before. Whether the weaving was worth the cost is the question that runs through every page of the series that followed, like a river running under ice, always present, rarely directly visible, shaping everything above it. For now, let the 7 kingdoms simply be what they were. Ancient, complicated, beautiful in their separate particularity, and wholly unaware of what the morning was about to bring. And across the narrow sea, the ships were loaded, the horses were aboard. The 3 dragons had already stretched their wings in the cold morning air and found it adequate. The moment of preparation was over. What came next was the crossing, and after the crossing, the burning shore. You are drifting now. Let that be enough. Simply drifting, carried on whatever current the night provides. The 7 kingdoms are behind us. The cold of Dragonstone is behind us. What lies ahead is the moment when the plan became real, when 3 dragons and a modest army of roughly 1,600 soldiers crossed the narrow sea and landed on the Westerosi shore, and the world became the kind of place where things like that happen. Breathe slowly. The crossing was not dramatic in the way you might imagine. It was simply a fleet of ships moving through the dark, carrying an intention that was larger than the ships, and arriving at a muddy riverbank in the grey light of a Westerosi morning. The place where Aegon landed was a bend in the river that would one day be called the Blackwater Rush, where the river curved toward the sea, and the land was flat and muddy and entirely unremarkable. There was no great city here, no port, no existing fortification worth mentioning. Just a confluence of water and geography that happened to be well positioned for a landing. Close to the Kingswood, near enough to the centre of the continent to matter, far enough from any major existing settlement that the landing could be established before opposition could be organised. It was chosen by design, not by chance. Aegon was not an impulsive man. He had been planning this crossing for years, and the choice of landing site was part of the plan. He called the hill at the river's edge Aegon's High Hill. He built a wooden fort on it within days. And then he began to talk. This is one of the most underappreciated aspects of Aegon's conquest. How much of it was accomplished through conversation rather than fire. The dragons were always present as a background fact. The listeners knew they were there, in the hills above the camp, occasionally visible at altitude. But Aegon did not use them immediately, indiscriminately, against everyone who had not yet bent the knee. He sent ravens. He received delegations. He made the same offer to every lord and king he encountered. Acknowledge my authority, pay your taxes, and answer my call to arms. Keep your seat, and your house, and your traditions, and your local autonomy, and the dragons stay on the ground. This was not generosity. It was strategy. A conquered continent that had been burned into submission provides taxes for a generation and resentment for centuries. A continent that had submitted through negotiation was more expensive to acquire, but cheaper to hold. The River Lords were the first to respond. They arrived at Aegon's camp within days of the landing, because they had been waiting for exactly this kind of change in circumstances. And because the arithmetic of their situation was not complicated, they had been subjects of Harren the Black for a generation, living under a king they despised in a tradition they found incomprehensible. And here was an alternative that required only that they transfer their loyalty from one ruler to another. The new ruler had dragons. The old ruler had Harrenhal, which was still technically under construction, and which had depopulated the riverlands to fill its building sites for 40 years. The choice was not difficult. House Tully, which would go on to anchor the middle of Westerosi politics for 300 years, bent the knee at Aegon's wooden fort before the fort's roof was fully complete. They would be rewarded for this. Rewards for timeliness would become a consistent feature of the way the Targaryens organized their world. The ravens Aegon sent to the Seven Kings were simple documents by the standards of diplomatic correspondence. Acknowledge Targaryen sovereignty, maintain your house, or face destruction. They were not threats dressed as invitations, though some of the recipients chose to read them that way. They were honest statements of what Aegon was offering and what he was prepared to do if the offer was declined. Most of the recipients read them, consulted their advisors, calculated the mathematics of the situation, and responded with something between outrage and anxiety. Argilac of the Stormlands reportedly sent back the hands of the Targaryen Meister who delivered the message, which is perhaps the most direct possible expression of contempt Buddhism in the judgment of any military historian who has studied the subsequent events, a strategically sophisticated response. The Lord of the Stormlands had chosen his ground. The ground would shortly choose him back. It is worth sitting with the image of King's Landing as it was in those first weeks, not the city we know from the series, with its million-person population, and its Red Keep, and its great sept of Baelor, but the thing it was before all of that. A wooden fort on a muddy hill, a flat area of cleared ground where soldiers camped, a few supply ships pulled up on the riverbank. That was the beginning of the most powerful city in the history of Westeros. That was the seed of a metropolis. The Targaryens did not choose this site because it was already important. They chose it because its geography made it defensible, and its central position made it appropriate for a capital. And then, over the course of a generation of deliberate planning and growth, it became important, not the other way around. This is how almost all great cities begin, with a practical decision made on practical grounds, with no awareness that the decision is going to define the geography of an empire. Sit with that for a moment. The city of King's Landing, the city that Jon Snow marches toward and that Daenerys burns 3 centuries later, and that every political drama of the series revolves around, began as a wooden fort that a 27-year-old built on a muddy riverbank because it was the most defensible flat ground near the mouth of a useful river. The Red Keep did not yet exist. The Iron Throne had not yet been forged. The Great Sept was generations away. There were no brothels, no guilds, no street of silk, no street of steel. There was a hill and a river and a wooden structure that smelled of green timber and ambition. Everything that followed from that. The million lives that would be built and ended within those walls over the next 300 years flowed from a practical decision made by a young man who believed he was fulfilling a prophecy. Aegon's manner with the lords who came to him in those early weeks was studied and consistent. He listened. He asked questions. He was courteous in the way that a man is courteous when he is not trying to seem courteous, but is simply trying to conduct a productive conversation, which is the most effective kind of courtesy, and the rarest. He had been well prepared by his upbringing on Dragonstone, where the small household of retainers had ensured that he knew everyone by name, and everyone's concerns were his concerns by necessity. He had none of the insulating distance of a king who has grown up in a large court with layers of hierarchy between himself and the people he ruled. He was, in the first weeks of the Conquest, genuinely approachable, which is not a quality that conquerors are usually celebrated for, and which is perhaps why it is not the quality that the histories of the Conquest tend to emphasize. Rhaenys moved through the early encampment with the ease of someone who has decided that the human geography of a new place is as interesting as the physical one. She learned names. She identified which lords had brought their families, and which had left wives and children at home, as a calculated expression of reserve. She noticed which men spoke freely, and which chose their words with the careful deliberation of someone who is calculating the implications of each sentence before it leaves their mouth. She carried this intelligence back to Aegon, not as formal reports, but as conversation. The way someone who genuinely enjoys people carries information about the people they've talked to, as the natural byproduct of genuine interest, rather than as the deliberate product of espionage. Aegon used it. He always used it in the way that a good commander uses every advantage available without making a performance of the using. The wooden fort grew quickly. Within a month of landing, it had been extended and reinforced into something that had the feel, if not quite the structure, of permanence. Supplies arrived from the river lords, whose cooperation made the logistics of the early conquest far more manageable than they would otherwise have been. Additional lords arrived to swear allegiance, each one a small accretion of legitimacy, each bending knee saying to the next, in the most concrete possible language, that the calculation had been made, and that this was the direction history was moving. Aegon received each of them with the same studied courtesy. He made commitments about the continuity of their holdings. He was scrupulous about keeping those commitments, which in the political context of a conquest was sufficiently remarkable to be remarked upon. A king who keeps his word when keeping it is inconvenient, is a king that lords can plan around. Planning requires predictability. Predictability is a form of power. What Aegon was building in those first weeks, alongside the fort and the political relationships and the military infrastructure, was a mythology. Every great political project requires a founding mythology, a story about what it is and why it exists and what distinguishes it from simple power. Aegon's mythology was the Song of Ice and Fire, the idea that this conquest was not simply an act of territorial acquisition, but a necessary response to an existential threat that most people could not yet see. He shared this directly with very few, with his sisters, with his closest advisers, with lords whose loyalty he had already secured, and who had demonstrated the capacity for trust. With others he shared it indirectly, in the quality of his seriousness, in the particular weight he brought to discussions of the Wall, and what the Night's Watch did, and whether the ancient treaties with the dead had been properly maintained. He planted the mythology in the soil of his actions and let it grow at its own pace. The city that grew from that wooden fort on Aegon's high hill would, 3 centuries later, be the stage on which nearly everything we know from the series would play out. The Red Keep that replaced the fort, built by Aegon's son Maegor the Cruel in a construction project that killed the builders, a grim and fitting founding story for a seat of power built on violence, would house every Targaryen king until the dynasty's end. The streets that grew up around the hill would fill with 1 million people whose lives were shaped in ways they mostly couldn't see by the decisions made in the Red Keep above them, and the city's relationship to the Iron Throne would be one of the series' most persistent observations about the nature of power. That what is built to serve becomes, over time, what must be served. That the city the Targaryens founded to anchor their rule eventually became something larger and more complicated than any single dynasty could contain. When Daenerys Targaryen burns King's Landing in the final season, an act that the series presents as simultaneously understandable and catastrophic, she is burning the thing that her ancestor built from nothing. She is destroying the physical embodiment of 300 years of Targaryen rule and misrule, of ambition and ideology and dynastic accident. She is completing, in fire, the project that Aegon began with fire. There is a terrible symmetry to this. Aegon burned to build, Daenerys burns to begin again. Whether what she intends to build on the ash is better than what burned is a question the series raises and then leaves, which is perhaps the most honest thing it could do, given that what comes after any great burning is never visible in the smoke. Jon Snow walks through the ruins of King's Landing, knowing that his father, his real father, his Targaryen father, wanted this city to be the beating heart of a unified realm that could withstand the long night. He walks through the ash of that dream and has to decide what to do about it. The decision he makes, the choice that ends the series, that resolves the question of who will sit on the Iron Throne by dissolving the question, is in some ways the final act of the Conquest. It is the moment when the structure Aegon built is examined by the person who was supposed to be its inheritor, and found to be, in its current form, not the answer to the dream, but an obstacle to it. Whether Jon's solution is right is something the series leaves to the viewer. But that it is a response to Aegon's original project, 300 years later, seems almost certain. Let the image of the early settlements settle in your mind. The wooden fort, the muddy hill, the cold morning air over the Blackwater rush. It was small, it was temporary. It smelled of green wood and river mud, and the smoke of cooking fires, and the particular anxiety of people who are at the beginning of something large and are not yet sure it will work. But it would work. In ways that its builders could not fully predict, in ways that would involve enormous suffering and enormous beauty, and the full range of what human civilization seems always to produce when given enough time. It would work. The city would grow. The throne would be built. The dynasty would rise and eventually fall. All of it beginning from a practical decision made on practical grounds, on a muddy morning, at a bend in a river. Sleep well. History is always smaller at the beginning than it will seem from the end. But the 7 kings were not all willing to simply receive ravens and calculate their options in quiet. 2 of them, the greatest military powers in Westeros, the Reach and the Westerlands, had decided to combine their armies and settle the question on the field. It was the rational response, the obvious one, the choice that should have worked. It did not work. What happened instead became the defining moment of the Conquest, and the grass did not grow back for a generation. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to resolve tonight. You are held and warm, and the night has nothing to ask of you except rest. We are approaching the single most important afternoon in the history of Westeros. The afternoon when everything became clear, when the mathematics of the Conquest resolved itself into a single undeniable answer. When the world understood what it was dealing with, and most of it chose to stop dealing with it. The Field of Fire. The name was given to it afterward by people trying to describe what they had seen to people who would not believe them. It was, in the strictest sense, a battle. In the deepest sense, it was a demonstration. The difference between a battle and a demonstration is whether the outcome was ever genuinely in question. The forces that assembled against Aegon in what would become known as the Field of Fire were, by any conventional military calculation, overwhelming. King Mern IX of House Gardner and King Loren Thryggr of House Lannister had done something that Westerosi kings almost never managed to do. They had set aside their own mutual interests long enough to recognize a common threat and combine their armies. Together, they fielded approximately 55,000 soldiers, cavalry and pikemen and archers and men-at-arms in the numbers that the Reach and Westerlands could muster, when they were both fully committed and both deeply motivated. Aegon's combined force, including the River Lords who had sworn to him, was considerably smaller. If you were counting soldiers, it was not a close contest. The question was never soldiers. The question was always something else. Mern IX was not a fool. The last Gardner King was a competent military commander who had fought several border campaigns and won them, and who understood the logic of combined arms and the value of numbers. He knew Aegon had dragons. He had presumably thought about what this meant. The conclusion he reached, and it is not, when you reconstruct the logic, an unreasonable conclusion, given only the information available to him, was that 3 dragons were a serious threat, but not an unanswerable one. He had 55,000 men. He had archers capable of hitting targets at altitude. He had pikemen who could form formations impervious to cavalry. He believed, not entirely without reason, that the sheer mass of his force could absorb what 3 dragons could inflict and continue fighting. He believed this right up until the moment the 3 dragons arrived over the field. The 3 dragons had never all been deployed simultaneously before the field of fire. There had been engagements in the weeks before, smaller battles where 1 dragon had been sufficient, where the appearance of a single creature overhead had been enough to break the formation and the will of an opposing force. But those were skirmishes. Those were the opening conversations of a negotiation that was still ongoing. This was different. This was the conversation that was supposed to end the negotiation, the force that was supposed to demonstrate to the Targaryen pretender that Westeros was not his to take. Mern and Loren had brought everything they had because they understood, correctly, that this was likely to be the decisive engagement of the Conquest. If they failed here, there would be no second chance at this scale. They were right about that. They were wrong about the outcome. Aegon rode Balerion, Visenya rode Vhagar. Rhaenys rode Meraxes, and they came over the field of tall grass and the assembled formations of 55,000 men in the summer afternoon, and they used their fire simultaneously, as they had never done before. The accounts of what followed, written by survivors, reconstructed by historians from the fragmentary evidence that exists when most of the witnesses are dead, share a consistent quality of inadequacy. Language has not built the words for what happened. Fire is a word that describes the thing you light candles with, the thing you cook over, the thing that occasionally gets out of control in a dry season and burns some fields before being stopped by a firebreak. The word fire is not built to describe what 3 mature dragons produce when they are using everything they have over a field of 55,000 soldiers on a dry summer day. The chronicles settle, eventually, for simply reporting the numbers. It is worth sitting with those numbers for a moment, in the quiet of wherever you are resting, with the weight of your body pressing gently into whatever holds it. 4,000 soldiers killed outright. Many more burned to varying degrees of severity. The grass itself burning. The air above the field heated to a temperature that made visibility impossible from the ground, and made breathing a project rather than an automatic function. The sound, which the accounts try to describe and fail, of a fire that large, which is not the crackling and popping of familiar flames, but something closer to a sustained roar. A sound below and above the normal range of hearing simultaneously, felt in the chest and the bones rather than only heard through the ears. And somewhere in that sound, Meraxes Gardener, last king of an unbroken line reaching back 4,000 years to Garth Greenhand, died. The extinction of House Gardener is the tragedy at the centre of the field of fire, and it is worth dwelling on it with the kind of attention it deserves, rather than rushing past it in the direction of what came next. Meraxes had no heir who survived the battle. His sons and grandsons, the entire continuation of the Gardener line, died with him in the field or in the burning of the retreating forces. A family that had been kings for 4,000 years, that had grown the reach from scattered farming settlements into the richest and most populous kingdom in Westeros, that had sat on the oaken seat for generations, so many, that the oak itself had grown enormous around the kings who perched on it. That family simply ended. Not defeated in the sense that usually means defeated. Not captured or exiled or reduced to lordship. Ended. The line complete, the name without an inheritor, the history closed. Loren Lannister survived. He had been in a different part of the field, perhaps further from the worst of the fire, perhaps simply more mobile, perhaps possessed of a luck that is not easy to attribute to anything but the arbitrary mercy of an arbitrary afternoon. He survived, and he made a decision that demonstrated either wisdom or pragmatism or simple honesty about what he had just witnessed, and probably all 3. He surrendered. He rode to Aegon's position under a flag of truce, and he bent the knee, and he swore his loyalty, and he asked what would be required of him going forward. And Aegon, in a move that was either calculated generosity or genuine magnanimity, and which was probably both simultaneously, told him that what would be required was what had always been on offer: taxes, military service when called, and the acknowledgement of Targaryen authority over the realm. Casterly Rock would remain Lannister. The gold would remain Lannister. The pride would have to be adjusted slightly. On the same day, possibly while the field was still burning, possibly slightly after, in the way that great events tend to overlap at the edges of their timing, Aegon flew Balerion north to the castle on the banks of the God's Eye, where Harren the Black sat in his towers that touched the clouds and declined to surrender. Harren had refused Aegon's ravens. He had reportedly said that his walls were strong enough to withstand any dragon, which is the kind of statement that looks considerably better in advance than in retrospect. He may have believed it. The towers of Harrenhal were the largest structures built in Westeros, built of the densest stone, built for purposes that included military defense against conventional medieval siege warfare. Harrenhal was not built against dragons. No one had built against dragons in the past 100 years, because there had been no dragons to build against. Balerion melted the towers of Harrenhal, not destroyed them in the sense of knocking them down or collapsing their structure, melted them, heated the stone to the point of liquefaction, so that the towers sagged and slumped into shapes that were neither the intentional forms they had been built into, nor rubble, but something stranger. Something between architecture and geology, the permanent record of what fire at that temperature does to limestone and mortar. The towers of Harrenhal still stood after Balerion was done with them. They still stand. They are recognizably towers in the sense that they are tall, vertical structures. But they are warped, melted, slumped. Monuments to the afternoon they met something they were not built to survive. Harren the Black and his sons died inside them. The castle itself, twisted into something between fortress and sculpture, would become the most unlucky seat in Westeros, a quality that the histories attribute to the manner of its founding, but which might simply reflect the fact that it was too large to be useful and too strange to be comfortable. What the Field of Fire accomplished, beyond the killing, beyond the extinction of House Gardener, beyond the specific tactical and political outcomes, was something that cannot be measured in soldiers or territory. It accomplished a transformation in the Westerosi understanding of what was actually happening. Before the Field of Fire, the Conquest was a crisis, something serious and threatening, something that needed to be addressed, something that prudent kings should respond to with military force while the opportunity still existed. After the Field of Fire, the Conquest was a fact. It was no longer a question of whether Aegon would succeed, but of when each remaining kingdom would submit. The demonstration had been made. The lesson had been delivered. The price of non-submission had been denominated in terms that 55,000 soldiers and 4,000 of them dead, and the extinction of the oldest royal house in Westeros could make clear in a way that ravens could not. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Field of Fire echoes through the series in two directions simultaneously. Looking forward, toward the modern characters. The Tyrells who inherited the Reach from the extinct Gardeners carry in their warmth and their political sophistication the cultural bones of Gardener tradition, even though they cannot inherit the name. Mace Tyrell's pride, Olenna Tyrell's sharpness, Margaery Tyrell's understanding of how to make political necessity feel like genuine affection. All of this is Gardener inheritance, transmitted through 4 generations of Tyrell rule, mellowed and refined by time, but still present in the way that the character of any land and any long-ruling family is present in the people who come after. The Lannisters' complicated relationship with their own pride, their perpetual awareness that the gold runs deep but not infinitely deep, that confidence must be continuously maintained, because the moment it is doubted, it begins to erode, has its roots in the afternoon when Loren de Fulton bent the knee and found that survival was more important than sovereignty. Looking backward, toward what the Field of Fire meant for the nature of the Conquest as a historical project, it was the moment when the Conquest became irreversible. Before the field, there was a theoretical possibility of organized resistance, a possibility that Mern and Loren had attempted to realize. After the field, no such organized resistance was possible, because the organized resistance had been shown to be ineffective in the most dramatic terms available. What remained was the individual calculation. Was submission better than the alternative? For most of the remaining lords and kings after the Field of Fire, the answer was clear. The alternative had been demonstrated. The demonstration was the field, and the field was still smoking when Aegon received Loren Lannister's surrender, and the smoke was visible from a considerable distance, and that was entirely intentional. Let those images settle into quiet. The field burning, the towers melting, a 4,000-year dynasty ending in an afternoon. A proud king choosing survival over sovereignty, and finding, to his probable surprise, that the terms were bearable. History tends to produce its most decisive moments without warning. The afternoon when everything changes looks, at its beginning, like an ordinary afternoon. The sun was presumably the same as it always was. The grass was presumably green before it burned. And then 3 dragons came over the horizon, and ordinary ended, and what came after began. Sleep well. The most consequential afternoon in Westerosi history is behind us. What follows is the work of consolidation, which is, in its own way, no less interesting and considerably less fire. To the north, word was spreading. Scouts who had watched the Field of Fire from safe distances were riding toward Winterfell with reports that the great lords of the Westerosi Council chambers refused to believe until the scouts described it 3 times over. The North had the largest remaining undefeated army in Westeros, and its king was about to make a decision that would define his family for the next 3 centuries. Breathe slowly. You are still. The weight of history is not something you have to carry right now. It is simply something you can observe from a comfortable distance as it moves through the world without asking your permission. We have watched the Field of Fire. We have seen what fire and 3 dragons made of the greatest army Westeros had assembled. Now we go north. Further north than the burning field. Further north than the reaches of the Targaryen ravens. Into the cold and forested world, where a king named Torrhen Stark was sitting in Winterfell, reading reports he didn't want to believe, and thinking about a decision that no one in his position had ever had to make before. Torrhen Stark is remembered, to the extent that he is remembered, by his title, the King Who Knelt. It is not a flattering title. It carries within it a suggestion of cowardice, an implication that a braver man would have fought. But to understand Torrhen Stark properly, to understand the weight of the decision he made and what it actually cost him, requires setting aside the title for a moment and looking at the man beneath it. In the winter of the year, Aegon's conquest began, sitting with his lords and his scouts and his maps, and making the most consequential calculation that any king in the north had ever made. He made it correctly. History has been unkind to him for it. History, in this as in many things, is wrong. Torrhen had the largest army still in the field after the Field of Fire. Approximately 45,000 soldiers. Some chronicles say fewer, some say more, but the broad consensus puts the northern host at a size that would have been formidable against any conventional opponent. They were hardened men, northern men, men who had spent their lives in a climate that treated softness as a character flaw and rewarded endurance above almost every other quality. They were not afraid of fighting. They were not afraid of dying. in the particular way that men who have internalized the northern relationship to the cold and the dark and the permanent possibility of a hard winter are not afraid of dying, not because they don't value their lives, but because they have a long practice of holding their own lives in proportion to larger things. They were, in every conventional military sense, a serious army. The march south had taken weeks. Torrhen had organized it with the deliberate efficiency of a man who understood logistics, who knew that an army that arrives hungry and disorganized from a long march is worth less than half its theoretical value. The northern host moved with the steady, unhurried pace of people who understand the difference between urgency and haste, who know that the goal is to arrive in fighting condition, rather than simply to arrive quickly. Along the way, the reports found them. Scouts who had been further south, who had seen what had happened at the Field of Fire, who had come north with the specific, verifiable details that distinguish eyewitness testimony from rumor. The field was still visible from miles away. The towers of Harrenhal could be seen on the horizon, their tops sagging in shapes that stone towers do not make naturally. 45,000 Northmen marched south and heard these things and kept marching. They stopped at the Trident. The river that runs through the centre of Westeros, that would be the site of Robert Baratheon's famous duel with Rhaegar Targaryen 3 centuries later, was where Torrhen Stark halted his army and made camp and called his lords together for the council that would determine the shape of northern history for the next 300 years. The camp on the north bank of the Trident, in the grey days of late autumn, was large enough that it was visible from considerable distances. 45,000 soldiers make an impression on a landscape, even when they are standing still. On the south bank, within sight, the vanguard of Aegon's forces had established its own camp. And somewhere above the tree line, at altitude, the silhouette of a dragon was intermittently visible against the clouds. Torrhen's council did not last long, by the standards of councils debating civilizational decisions. The lords of the north were not men who enjoyed elaborate deliberation for its own sake. They were men who respected honesty about the situation in front of them, and the situation in front of them was honest in the extreme. On one side of a river, 45,000 northern soldiers who had never been defeated in any battle anyone could remember. On the other side, a force of uncertain size that had dragons. What the scouts had reported about the Field of Fire was specific. 55,000 soldiers of the Reach and Westerlands combined, 4,000 dead, the grass still burning, House Gardener extinct, Harrenhal melted, and those were the outcomes for the largest army Westeros had assembled in living memory, fighting on ground of their choosing, with the preparations of months behind them. Sit with that calculation for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are resting. Torrhen Stark was not a coward. He had proven his courage in a series of border conflicts along the edges of the north, against the Iron Islands, against incursions from the Riverlands, against the various frictions that a large and often contested borderland generates over time. He was 60 years old and had ruled for decades, and had never in those decades encountered a problem that courage alone could not contribute meaningfully to solving. But he was also a man who understood arithmetic, and the arithmetic of the situation at the Trident was not ambiguous. He could fight. He would lose. The 45,000 Northmen who had marched south under his banner would die in a burning field, and then the North would have no army, and then the North would also have no negotiating position, and then whatever the Targaryens chose to impose on it would simply be imposed. His maester, Vulcan, or whoever the maester actually was, in the accounts that blur slightly at this level of historical detail, argued for submission. The calculations were presented clearly. The alternative to submission was not victory. The alternative to submission was the Field of Fire. reproduced on the banks of the Trident, with northern soldiers instead of Reach soldiers, and the north instead of the Reach, as the kingdom left without a ruling family afterward. Torrhen listened. He was the kind of man who listened, which is rarer than it sounds in anyone, and particularly rare in kings. He asked his lords what they thought. The lords looked at each other. They looked at the dragon silhouette against the clouds. They gave him the most honest answers they had, which were all variations on the same theme: fight and die, or yield and live. Torrhen Stark crossed the Trident the next morning and bent the knee before Aegon on the south bank, in front of both armies, with the deliberateness of a man who had made his peace with the decision and was not going to perform ambivalence for an audience. He took off his crown. He placed it at Aegon's feet. He swore the oaths. And Aegon, in a move entirely consistent with his behaviour throughout the Conquest, raised him up, returned his seat and his authority and his warden's power over the North, and named him Warden of the North rather than Lord of the North, an acknowledgement that what the North required was a steward of unusual capability rather than simply a subordinate lord. Torrhen was given back almost everything he had surrendered, minus the crown and the theoretical independence it represented. The crown was gone. Everything else remained. What Torrhen gave up in that moment is clear. The sovereignty that 8,000 years of Stark rule had maintained. The right to call himself a king, to raise armies solely in his own name, to conduct diplomacy as a fully independent state. These were not small things. They were the things that define what a kingdom is, as opposed to what a very large and powerful province is. And Torrhen knew exactly what he was giving up as he gave it up. What he gained is sometimes overlooked in the tendency to read his decision as a defeat. He gained the lives of 45,000 soldiers who would otherwise have burned. He gained the continuity of the North as a political and cultural entity. He gained, for the North and its people, the ability to continue being the North, to maintain its old gods and its old ways and its memory and its austerity and its relationship to the cold and the dark that had defined it for 8,000 years. He gave up a crown. He kept a civilization. There is a question that runs through Stark family history in ways that the series has never quite finished answering. Whether the submission at the Trident was the foundational act of Northern honour or the foundational wound. Whether bending the knee to Aegon established a tradition of the North being loyal to the realm that it had pledged itself to, or whether it established a wound in the Northern identity that has never fully healed. The awareness, running beneath everything the North has been for 300 years, that once a Stark king chose survival over sovereignty, and that the terms of the arrangement have never fully sat right since. Ned Stark's rigid sense of honour. Robb Stark's decision to declare himself king in the North. Jon Snow's complicated relationship with oaths and duties that conflict with each other. All of it has Torrhen's crossing of the Trident somewhere in its roots. Ned Stark carried Torrhen's choice in his blood without knowing its specific weight, in the way that children carry the consequences of their ancestors' decisions without being aware of the particular afternoon on which those decisions were made. His honour, that absolute, inflexible, politically naive commitment to the truth as he understood it, the commitment that killed him, is the North's character made personal, and the North's character was formed in part by the specific experience of being a vast kingdom that once had everything, and that chose to preserve what it had by giving up the title that described it. A people that has made that choice tends to become deeply attached to what it kept. The Starks are attached to the North the way people are attached to what they nearly lost, not comfortably, intensely. Robb Stark's decision to crown himself king in the North, the decision that launches the War of the Five Kings, and that ends eventually in the Red Wedding, is in a real sense the reversal of Torrhen's decision 3 centuries earlier. Where Torrhen had chosen the realm over the crown, Robb chose the crown over the realm. He saw what the Lannisters had made of the realm, and decided it was no longer worth the name, and he took back the title that Torrhen had surrendered. He was right about the Lannisters. He was wrong about what taking back the title would cost. The reversal of Torrhen's choice was not a simple matter of reclaiming something that had been given up. It was a complex political and military project that required alliances Robb made badly, and trust he extended to the wrong people. The King Who Knelt had 300 years to become a wound. When Robb Stark tried to heal it, the wound struck back. And Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, though he does not know it, will eventually make a version of the same choice that Torrhen made at the Trident. He will bend the knee to Daenerys Targaryen voluntarily, in front of his bannermen who are furious about it, in exchange for what he believes is a larger necessity than northern independence. He will surrender the title and ask his lords to accept it and be betrayed by the same combination of genuine grievance and wounded pride that has made the North's relationship to submission complicated for 300 years. The choice Torrhen made at the Trident echoes forward in his descendants, like a sound in a long corridor. Dying slowly, never quite fading, let Torrhen Stark rest for a moment in your awareness. Not as the King Who Knelt, not as the man who surrendered, but as a 60-year-old king standing on the south bank of the Trident in the grey morning, having made the most difficult decision of his long life, choosing the thing that would last over the thing that would flash and end. He was right. He paid for being right in the currency that history tends to charge for right decisions made under duress. The title of coward, attached by people who did not have to make the decision, and therefore do not understand its weight. Sleep well. The North survived. That was the point. That was always the point. To the south, another kingdom was making the same calculation through different means. Argilac of the Stormlands would make the opposite choice. He would fight, in the tradition of Storm Kings, and the fight would find him worthy and kill him. And to the west, high in mountains that touched the sky, a child king was about to be visited by something that would change the nature of his mourning. You are still and warm. Whatever pulled at you today has loosened its grip, and the dark is soft around you. And there is no need to hold any of this tightly. Let it simply be images, moving at their own pace through the long quiet of the night. We have left Torrhen Stark at the Trident. We move now in two directions simultaneously, because the Conquest, like all great events, was not a single story unfolding in sequence, but many stories happening at once, in different corners of a continent too large for any one person to oversee. To the south, in the storm-battered lands below the Blackwater Rush, a last king was preparing to fight. To the northwest, behind the highest mountains in Westeros, a child was about to be visited by something extraordinary. The last Storm King was a man named Argilac Durrandon, and his title, Argilac the Arrogant, captures both his quality and his fate. He had received Aegon's ravens and responded, reportedly, by sending back the hands of the maester who delivered them, a response that is direct and unambiguous, and completely disastrous as a diplomatic opening position, but which had the merit of honesty. He did not want to negotiate. He did not want to submit. He was a warrior king who had earned his throne through personal courage in battle, and he was not going to hand it to anyone who had not demonstrated equal courage in the field. This was, from the perspective of his own values, an entirely coherent position. It was, from the perspective of every military calculation available to an outside observer, a position that was going to kill him. Aegon sent Orys Baratheon to take the Stormlands. This choice tells you something important about how Aegon understood loyalty and merit and the relationship between the two. Orys was his closest companion, and rumoured, by those who looked at them and saw the resemblance, and drew what seemed like the obvious conclusion to be his bastard half-brother, a rumour Aegon neither confirmed nor denied, which is itself a kind of answer. Orys was not Targaryen. He did not have a dragon. He had instead the quality that Aegon valued more than almost any other in a commander. He thought clearly under pressure. He did not confuse bravery with rashness, and he understood that the goal of a campaign was not personal glory, but the achievement of a specific political and military outcome. He rode south with an army and a mandate, and he met Argilac in the field in a battle that the histories call the Last Storm. The Last Storm was fought in the rain, which seems appropriate, the Stormlands getting in the last word, offering the most local possible weather conditions for the final act of the Durrandon dynasty. Argilac fought personally. He was 60 years old, and he could still fight, and he chose to fight, and he challenged Orys to single combat in the tradition of warrior kings, who believe that the outcome of a battle between two men of quality is more meaningful than the outcome of a battle between two armies. Orys accepted. The two men fought in the rain and the mud of the Stormlands, and Argilac was killed. He died as a Storm King, in the storm, which is a kind of poetry that history does not usually provide with this degree of specificity. He died well, by the standards of a tradition that measured kings by how they died. The Stormlands died with him. Orys Baratheon married Argilac's daughter, Argella, a match that transformed the Conquest's outcome in the Stormlands from military occupation to dynastic absorption. Argella had initially refused to submit, had barricaded herself in Storm's End, had declared her intention to die in the defence of her father's castle, rather than surrender to the man who had killed him. This is a position that requires a certain admiration, regardless of its strategic merits. Her own garrison eventually forced her hand. They surrendered and handed her over, because garrisons under siege are ultimately practical about these things in a way that pride sometimes prevents the people they serve from being. Orys, rather than treating her as a prisoner or a hostage, offered her marriage. He took the Durrandon words and seat and arms. The Baratheons were born from the ashes of the Durrandons, inheriting their identity as much as their territory. But it is to the Vale that we must travel now, because the story of the Vale's submission is the most unusual of all the Conquest's resolutions and the most quietly perfect. The Eyrie, the castle that sat at the peak of the Giant's Lance, accessible only through three-way castles and a very long climb, was legitimately one of the most defensible positions in Westeros. Conventional military wisdom held that it could not be taken by siege. The approach was too narrow, the natural fortifications too complete, the castle's position too elevated for any force attempting to approach from below. The Arryns had been secure behind their mountains for the entire history of the kingdom, and that security had given them a certain quality of calm confidence in their own untouchability that was, in the context of a conquest without dragons, entirely justified. Sit with the geography of the Eyrie for a moment, as you rest. A castle on a mountain top, accessible by a path that requires hours of climbing and passes through three-way castles, each of which can be held by a handful of defenders against virtually any conventional force. The kind of position that makes military commanders look at it and then look away, because the list of tools available for taking it by force is very short, and all of them are expensive. The Arryns had not needed to be militarily aggressive because geography had done their defending for them. Their pride was not entirely unearned. But all of that security rested on the assumption that any attack would come from below. Visenya rode Vhagar to the Eyrie. She did not approach from below. She flew, which is, in its way, the most elegant solution possible to the problem of a castle that cannot be reached from the ground, the kind of solution that seems obvious in retrospect, but that the Arryn's entire defensive strategy had failed to account for. Vhagar was not the largest of the three dragons, but she was large enough, and Visenya on her back was the most capable warrior of the Conquest, and together they descended from the sky into the courtyard of the Eyrie, in a moment that every account agrees was unexpected in the most complete sense of the word. The Queen Regent was not in the courtyard. The household guard was not organized for an aerial incursion. What was in the courtyard was a child. The child was Rhaenys Arryn, King of the Mountain and the Vale, approximately 6 years old by most accounts, playing in the castle's yard in the way that 6-year-old children play when no one has told them that something significant is about to happen. He looked up from whatever he was doing, and he saw Vhagar land in front of him. And he looked at Vhagar with the expression that every account agrees was not terror but wonder, the particular wide-eyed openness of a child encountering something magnificent that has not yet been categorized by his understanding as dangerous. And then Visenya dismounted, and she looked at this child, and the child looked at her, and the situation resolved itself in a way that no one had planned, and everyone in retrospect agreed was exactly right. The child asked to ride the dragon. The accounts are consistent on this point. Rhaenys Arryn, 6 years old, last king of an 8,000-year-old dynasty, looked at Vhagar with unfiltered longing and asked if he could ride her. What Visenya said to him varies slightly between accounts. Some have her agreeing outright. Some have her negotiating. Some have her asking what he would give for the ride. The version most histories have settled on is that she asked what he would pay, and that he said he would give her anything she asked, and that she said, "Your mother's loyalty and your house's fealty to my brother." And Rhaenys, 6 years old, said yes immediately, because 6 years old is old enough to understand that the dragon in the yard is magnificent, and not quite old enough to understand what sovereignty means. What is most remarkable about this exchange, what makes it the Conquest's most perfect moment, in a sense that the Field of Fire can never be, is what it reveals about Visenya's understanding of power. She had come to the Eyrie expecting to need to threaten, to coerce, to demonstrate the military reality of the situation in terms clear enough that the Queen Regent's pragmatism would override her pride. She had come prepared for negotiation under duress. What she found instead was a child, and she adapted instantly, with a flexibility that is not usually associated with the cold warrior queen of the histories. She saw what the moment required, not a demonstration of force, not a negotiation between political adults, but a gift to a child that would be remembered for a lifetime. She gave Rhaenys his dragon ride. She took the Vale without a drop of blood. This was, by any measure, the Conquest's most efficient military operation. The Queen Regent, Rhaenys' mother, the woman whose political calculation had been preempted by her son's spontaneous enthusiasm, ratified the agreement her 6-year-old had made. What choice did she have? The alternative was to tell her son that his dragon ride had been revoked, which is not a conversation that resolves easily, and to attempt to hold the Eyrie against an opponent who had already demonstrated that the Eyrie's greatest advantage was not an advantage against her. The Arryns bent the knee. The Vale was joined to the realm, and Rhaenys Arryn grew up to be remembered not as the last Arryn king, but as the boy who rode a dragon, which is the kind of legacy that tends to matter more in the long memory of a family than the specifics of which oaths were sworn. On which afternoon? The Vale's strange quality in the series, its ability to remain apart from the central conflicts for longer than any other region, its consistent tendency toward a kind of proud neutrality that is simultaneously protective and limiting, has its roots in the particular nature of its submission. The Arryns did not fight. They did not negotiate under duress. They submitted because a child asked to ride a dragon. And the geometry of that submission, voluntary, almost accidental, arranged around a child's wonder rather than an adult's calculation, gave the Arryns a different relationship to the Conquest than any other great house. They had not been defeated. They had not been compelled. They had simply been enchanted, in the most literal sense available, and the enchantment had carried forward in their sense of themselves as a family, apart from the usual Westerosi entanglements. Lysa Tully's decision to seal the Eyrie during Robert's rebellion, to withdraw the Vale from the conflict that was tearing the rest of Westeros apart, is the Arryn tradition expressing itself 3 centuries later. The Eyrie is safe. The mountain is unassailable. The Vale can wait out almost anything. And waiting is what the Arryns have done, with varying degrees of wisdom, since the morning Vhagar landed in their courtyard, and a 6-year-old king asked for the thing he wanted most. Robin Arryn, who sits in the Eyrie in the modern series in his mother's shadow, playing with his moondoor and nursing at his mother's breast at an age that made the Lords of the Vale deeply uncomfortable. He is the final form of a dynasty that began with a child's wonder and has never quite grown past it, that has remained, in some essential way, a tradition organized around the feeling of standing in a courtyard and watching a dragon land. Let the image of the Eyrie settle into your mind. The courtyard high above the clouds, the cold mountain air, the dragon folding her wings in a space barely large enough to contain her, and a child who looked up from his playing and was not afraid. There is something worth remembering about that response. The adult world responds to dragons with terror and calculation and political assessment. The child responded with wonder and immediate desire. Whether that is wisdom or simply inexperience is a question that the history of the Arryn family has spent 300 years not quite settling. But the moment itself is clean and beautiful, and it cost nothing except a promise. And the promise changed the shape of a kingdom. Sleep well. Sometimes history is made by 6-year-olds who ask for what they want. 6 kingdoms had now submitted in their various ways, through fire, through calculation, through surrender, through enchantment, through a child's spontaneous request. 6 kingdoms were now Targaryen. 1 had not submitted and would not. And the war with Dorne would cost more than all the other kingdoms combined, not in soldiers, but in something the Targaryens had not expected to lose. You are still resting. Let the weight of the night hold you. We have watched the Conquest assemble itself, kingdom by kingdom, submission by submission, some through fire and some through calculation, and one, most memorably, through a 6-year-old's unguarded wonder. Now we arrive at a different kind of question, and perhaps a harder one. The Conquest was complete in its military sense within approximately 2 years of Aegon's landing. 6 of the 7 kingdoms had submitted. The dragons had been demonstrated. The political arithmetic had been resolved in the most explicit terms available. What came after all of that, what the Targaryens built from the wreckage and the submission and the new arrangements, is in many ways the more interesting part of the story. Winning a conquest is a different problem than governing one. The 2 problems require different tools. Not every conqueror who is brilliant at the first is brilliant at the second. Aegon was crowned, if the stories are right, twice. Once hastily, at the wooden fort on Aegon's high hill, and once more formally at a ceremony on the hill itself, attended by a high septon who anointed him with the 7 oils, and the lords of the realm who had come to pay their respects to what the world had become. The double coronation tells you something important about the nature of what Aegon was building. He was not simply imposing Valyrian traditions on a Westerosi world. He was accepting the traditions of the world he had taken, submitting to the rites of the faith of the 7, allowing the High Septon to make him king in the terms that Westerosi culture understood a king to be made, even though his family's history was of a different religious tradition entirely. This was a political calculation, but it was also something more. A genuine understanding that the world he had taken was its own thing, with its own logic, and that the most efficient way to rule it was to speak its language. King's Landing grew with a speed that still impresses anyone who thinks carefully about the logistics involved. Within a decade of the landing, the wooden fort had been replaced by the beginnings of the Red Keep, the castle that would anchor the city's skyline for 300 years. Built on Aegon's high hill, with a grandeur that was deliberately intended to make clear that this was not a temporary arrangement. The construction was not completed in Aegon's lifetime. His son, Maegor the Cruel, would finish it, in a manner that became one of the founding stories of Westerosi cynicism about power. Maegor reportedly executed the builders when the castle was complete to preserve its secrets, though historians debate whether this actually happened, or whether it is the kind of story that a castle like that simply generates around itself over time. What is not debated is that the Red Keep, when it was finished, was among the most formidable fortifications in the world. The Dragon Pit was built on the hill of Rhaenys, named for the youngest of the queens, in a gesture of commemoration that predated the full knowledge of what that commemoration would eventually mean. The Dragon Pit was, in its time, an extraordinary structure. A great domed building large enough to house a dozen dragons, built to the specifications that Valyrian knowledge of dragon husbandry required. A practical acknowledgement that the Targaryen dynasty's most important assets needed infrastructure, and could not simply be left to sleep under the stars. The dragons that lived in the Dragon Pit over the subsequent generations were smaller than Balerion and Vhagar, and Meraxes had been much smaller, eventually, as the dynasty continued, and the dragons born in captivity proved to be less impressive than their ancestors. This diminishment would become one of the great ongoing mysteries of Targaryen rule, whether the dragons shrank because of the captivity, or because of the environment, or because of something in the Targaryen blood that was itself changing over generations of rule. The small council was Aegon's most lasting institutional invention, and it is worth dwelling on what an extraordinary thing it was in its context. Aegon created an advisory body of specialists, a master of coin, a master of laws, a master of ships, a master of whisperers, and gave them ongoing authority in their domains, the expectation that they would be consulted before major decisions, and the infrastructure to actually govern, rather than simply advise. The concept of governing a large polity through a cabinet of experts was not, in the history of human governance, original to Aegon. But it was original to Westeros, where royal courts had previously operated on the logic of personal loyalty and proximity to the king, rather than functional specialization. The small council is the political structure through which the entire main series is organized. Every political drama in King's Landing plays out through the small council, which is itself Aegon's creation. The hand of the king was perhaps even more significant. The concept of a deputy who could act with royal authority, who could make decisions when the king was absent or incapacitated, who could run the governing apparatus without requiring the king's personal presence for every transaction, was a recognition of something that kings often resist recognizing, that the kingdom is too large for any one person to govern alone, and that the attempt to do so produces either a state of permanent exhaustion in the king or a state of permanent paralysis in the government. Aegon's willingness to create the position of hand, to genuinely delegate real authority rather than simply granting nominal titles, was a form of political maturity that not all his successors would maintain. The history of the Iron Throne is largely a history of the relationship between the kings who sat on it and the hands who ran the realm around them. And most of the dysfunction that the series documents can be traced to the moments when that relationship broke down. Sit with the scale of what Aegon had built for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are. He had arrived on a muddy riverbank with 1,600 soldiers and 3 dragons. 2 years later, he ruled a continent. 6 of the 7 kingdoms had submitted. A capital city was under construction. An administrative structure was in place. A set of governing institutions, the small council, the hand, the Kingsguard, had been designed and staffed. The faith of the 7 had been engaged as a partner, rather than confronted as a potential rival. and the dynasty's most important remaining problem, Dorne, was being managed, or rather was refusing to be managed, in ways that would eventually transform the nature of Aegon's reign. This is extraordinary speed. This is not the pace at which political structures usually develop. Aegon was building with an urgency that suggests he believed he did not have time to be slow. And the urgency was almost certainly connected to the dream, to the sense that the long night was not a theoretical future possibility, but a thing that was going to arrive, and that the structure needed to be in place before it did. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Kingsguard deserves a particular mention because it represents the most elegant of Aegon's institutional inventions. 7 knights clad in white, sworn to protect the king above all other loyalties, forswearing land and marriage and inheritance in exchange for the absolute singular purpose of their role. The number 7 was deliberately chosen, a gesture toward the faith of the 7 that made the Kingsguard a bridge between the Targaryen dynasty and the Westerosi religious tradition it had adopted. The white cloaks were a visual language, purity of purpose, the absence of personal allegiance to any house or family. The white that contains all colours, and therefore commits to none. The first Kingsguard was composed of the most capable knights Aegon could find, selected with a care that established the institution's standards before the institution had a history to protect. Every subsequent Kingsguard member in the series, every white cloak, every sworn sword, is an inheritor of this original design. The governance of the conquered kingdoms was organized around a principle that was genuinely novel in the context of previous Westerosi political arrangements. Subsidiarity. Aegon did not impose Targaryen governors on the conquered regions. He left the existing lords in their existing seats, with their existing authority over their existing domains, and required of them only what the Ravens had promised: taxes, military service when called, and the acknowledgement of Targaryen overlordship in matters that exceeded local jurisdiction. The Starks remained wardens of the north. The Lannisters remained lords of Casterly Rock. The Arryns remained lords of the Eyrie. The local identities, the local customs, the local languages and traditions and ways of organizing daily life, all of these were left intact. Aegon's conquest was not a cultural replacement. It was a political addition, a layer of authority added above existing structures, rather than a wholesale replacement of those structures. This is what distinguished the Targaryen conquest from the kinds of empire building that tend to leave nothing behind but resentment and ruins. The conquered were not asked to stop being what they were. They were asked to acknowledge that they were now part of something larger than what they had been, and to contribute to that larger thing in specific and manageable ways. This was not generosity. It was again strategy, the recognition that a continent with 12,000 years of local culture and local identity cannot be homogenized from the top down without producing resistance that will eventually overwhelm whatever force is trying to impose it. Aegon was not a utopian. He was a pragmatist who had a very specific goal, a unified realm capable of responding to an existential threat, and who understood that the most efficient path to that goal ran through the preservation of existing arrangements, rather than their replacement. The governing structure Aegon built is the water that every fish in the main series swims in, without necessarily being aware that it is water. When Ned Stark serves as Hand of the King, he is occupying an office that Aegon designed. When Tywin Lannister runs the realm through his sons and his network of obligation and debt, he is working within a system of overlordship that Aegon established. When the small council argues about policy in its chambers above the dungeons of the Red Keep, it is playing out a dynamic that Aegon set in motion: the tension between the king's personal authority and the institutional authority of the council, between the vision at the top and the expertise distributed through the body of the government. Every political drama in the series is, at some level, a drama about the institutions Aegon built and whether they are working as designed. What Aegon could not entirely solve, what no founder of a great political structure entirely solves, is the problem of succession. The system he built was calibrated for a ruler with his particular combination of vision and pragmatism, and genuine curiosity about the world. His successors would not all share these qualities. Some would have the vision without the pragmatism, and burn cities for reasons they believed were necessary. Some would have the pragmatism without the vision, and let the institutions run on inertia, while the real power pooled in the hands of the hands. Some would have neither, and let the realm drift in the direction of whoever was most willing to push it. The institutions Aegon built were strong enough to survive all of this mostly. They persisted through 300 years of varying quality in the people who operated them. But they were not strong enough to survive the specific combination of events that ended the dynasty. No institutional design survives long enough to encounter every possible stress. Let the image of Aegon's realm in its early years settle into the soft background of the night. A capital city rising from a muddy hill. A council of experts meeting in a room that smells of new stone and candle wax. 7 white-cloaked knights keeping watch at a king's door. Lords in their ancient seats paying their taxes and attending their obligations, and slowly, in the specific way that human beings adapt to new realities, incorporating the new order into their understanding of how the world works. It was not perfect. Nothing built this quickly from such varied materials, with such different people trying to hold it together, is ever perfect. But it worked. For 300 years, it mostly worked. Sleep well. The empire is young, and the king is tired, and morning will bring dawn. And there was always dawn. The kingdom that said no, and meant it, and kept meaning it, and proved that there are some things that even 3 dragons cannot solve. The war with Dorne would reshape the Conquest's legacy, cost the Targaryens something they could not afford to lose, and haunt every subsequent decision Aegon made for the rest of his reign. You are still resting. Let that be the whole fact of this moment. You're breathing slow, the dark soft around you, nothing required. We have watched an empire assemble itself from fire and calculation, and, in one extraordinary case, a child's wonder. 6 kingdoms had submitted. The administration was in place. The Kingsguard was sworn. The Red Keep was rising on its hill above the Blackwater rush. By any measure available to the year 2 after the landing, the conquest was complete. And then there was Dorne. Dorne, which had not submitted. Dorne, which would not submit. Dorne, which had been watching the northern kingdoms fall one by one from behind its mountains and its deserts, and which had made a calculation of its own, not whether to resist, but how. Princess Meraxes Martell was old. The chronicles are consistent on this. She was fat and blind and slow by the time Aegon's ravens arrived at Sunspear, her body worn down by decades of rule, in a climate that is hard on even the hardiest, her vision largely gone to the cataracts that the desert sun eventually gives to everyone who lives long enough beneath it. She was, in the shorthand that history tends to apply to rulers it does not fully understand, unimpressive. But Meraxes Martell had ruled Dorne for decades, and had kept it independent through force, alliance, and the particular political intelligence that outlasts physical strength. She received Aegon's terms, the same terms offered to every other kingdom: submit, maintain your seat, pay your taxes, answer the call to arms, and she refused, not with the drama of Argilac's response, simply and completely, and without apparent anxiety. She refused, and she explained what would happen if Aegon pressed the issue, and everything she predicted turned out to be true. Dorne was different in ways that went past the political, past even the cultural, down into the geography itself. The Red Mountains formed the northern border, a range high enough to limit the passes to a few specific defensible points, each of which could be held by a small force against a much larger one indefinitely. South of the mountains lay the desert. Not the romantic navigable desert of adventure stories, but the genuine article, the kind of landscape that kills people through heat and thirst and disorientation, that defeats armies not through military opposition, but through the simple arithmetic of sustenance. An army in Dorne needed water. Water in Dorne was controlled by the people who lived there, who understood where it was and how to withhold it. An army that could not find water in the desert was already defeated. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. Merria Martell had no intention of meeting Aegon's forces in open battle. This decision, so obvious to anyone who understood the geography, and so difficult for military minds trained in the traditions of field engagements to fully accept, was the foundation of the entire Dornish strategy. She dispersed her soldiers. She instructed her lords to abandon their seats when the dragons came and retreat into the interior, into the desert and the mountain valleys, where dragons could see them but could not easily destroy what they needed to survive. Dorne's towns and castles could burn. Stone and sand don't die. The people went underground, went into the hills, went into the places the Targaryen army could not follow without dying of thirst 3 days later. When the dragons came, they found abandoned walls and empty streets, and they burned what was there to burn. And they accomplished nothing except the demonstration that burning empty buildings costs more in dragonfire than it gains in political submission. The Dornish strategy was patience made into military doctrine. Merria understood, with the clarity of someone who has lived long enough to see many enthusiasms exhaust themselves, that Aegon's greatest advantage was his dragons, and that his dragons could not govern a desert any more than they could govern the sea. The conquest required, eventually, the presence of administrators in the conquered territory. Administrators required supply lines. Supply lines in a desert required the cooperation, or at least the neutrality, of the local population. None of this was available in Dorne. The Dornishmen raided the supply lines. They struck at isolated garrisons in the night, killed the guards, and vanished back into the sand and rock before dawn. They sent assassins, not the crude kind, not soldiers in disguise, but genuine specialists in the art of disappearance and approach, into the Targaryen camps. And 2 of those assassins came very close to reaching Aegon himself before being intercepted by his Kingsguard. The war ground on. Nothing resolved. Nothing could resolve, while both sides had something to sustain them. What broke the stalemate was not a battle. It was a loss so specific and so personal that no subsequent military development could fully dislodge it from the center of the Targaryen understanding of the Dornish conflict. Rhaenys rode Meraxes over the Hellholt, the castle of House Ulla in the deep south of Dorne, and the Dornish had prepared for her. Not in the way armies prepare for dragons, not with archers and spearmen in defensive formations, but with the weapon that the history of dragon warfare had eventually produced. A scorpion bolt, a great iron quarrel launched from an oversized crossbow, positioned on the Hellholt's walls, aimed at Meraxes' eye. The eye is the weak point. The scales are too thick, the hide too resistant to most weapons, but the eye leads directly to the brain, and a bolt large enough and fast enough and aimed with sufficient skill can reach through an eye and into a brain. Meraxes fell. Rhaenys fell with her into the castle below. Sit with what that meant for a long moment. Rhaenys was not killed quickly. The chronicles agree on this, and what they agree on is difficult. She was alive when Meraxes fell. She was taken into the Hellholt alive. What happened to her after that is the subject of accounts that Aegon and Visenya spent decades trying to obtain, through envoys and ransoms offered, and threats made and promises extended, and the Dornish never answered clearly. They never returned her. They never confirmed what had been done to her. They simply held the knowledge of her fate as the most powerful negotiating chip available, used its uncertainty as a weapon more refined than any blade. What Aegon and Visenya were left with was the thing that uncertainty does to grief. It cannot close. There is nothing to bury. There is nothing to confirm, and therefore nothing to mourn completely. The wound stays open because the wound cannot be named. Aegon's grief transformed him in ways that the histories describe carefully, and the chronicles around them confirm. He had been, for the first years of the Conquest and the early years of the reign, a man of measured purpose, driven by the vision, yes, and capable of terrible action when the vision required it, but not given to rage, not given to the kind of destruction that springs from personal anguish, rather than political calculation. After Rhaenys, this changed. The Dornish War darkened in ways that served no one's interests, including the Targaryens. Visenya pressed it with a fury that was no longer strategic. Aegon pressed it in the specific way that a man presses a cause he no longer fully believes in, but cannot stop pursuing, because stopping means accepting the loss, and the loss is the one thing he cannot accept. They burned. Dorne absorbed the burning. The sand does not mind being burned. The stone walls, charred and rebuilt, do not remember that they burned. The specific episode called The Burning of the Tongue captures the quality of the Dornish War most completely. Visenya, responding to an assassination attempt on Aegon's life, flew Vhagar along the Torrentine River and burned every settlement along its length, not in a single pass but methodically, settlement by settlement, giving each one time to see what was coming before it arrived. It was not a military operation. There were no soldiers in the settlements along the river. It was a demonstration of grief made into fire, a personal anguish expressed through the only language available to someone sitting on a dragon at altitude, the language of burning. And it accomplished nothing. The Dornishmen rebuilt. They mourned their own dead. They became, in the fire of Visenya's grief, more deeply committed to their resistance than they had been before. This is what personal anguish does when it is turned into policy. It achieves the opposite of its intention, because the opposite is what personal anguish achieves when it operates without the check of strategic thought. Meraxes' loss was the Conquest's most consequential military event after the Field of Fire, and it operated in the opposite direction. The Field of Fire had demonstrated that resistance was futile. The fall of Meraxes demonstrated that the Targaryens were not invincible, that their greatest advantage could be countered, at least under specific conditions, with sufficient preparation and sufficient patience. This knowledge spread through the remaining years of the dynasty, like a slowly opening door. The dragons were not permanent facts of nature. They could be killed. They could be taken down, if you were willing to prepare very carefully and wait very long and accept the certain destruction of wherever you were when the dragon died. The Dornish had been willing, and the knowledge that they had been willing, that somewhere in the desert people had sat in a tower with a giant crossbow and waited for a dragon with the specific intention of killing it, was never quite forgotten by anyone who understood what it meant. Aegon tried 3 times to formally subdue Dorne. Each attempt was more expensive than the last and achieved less. The desert was vast and patient and hostile to everyone who was not native to it. The Dornish were willing to absorb losses that would have broken other kingdoms, because they understood that they were playing a different game, not trying to defeat the Targaryens militarily, but simply to outlast their enthusiasm for a campaign that was costing more than it could ever produce. Eventually, Aegon accepted what was true. Dorne would not submit in his lifetime. He turned his attention to the other 6 kingdoms, and left Dorne in a state of contained but unresolved conflict, a wound in the southern border of his realm that would not close until his descendant Darren II married it closed nearly a century later, through a diplomatic arrangement rather than a military one. Which is, in retrospect, exactly what Merya Martell had suggested was the only viable option. In the first conversation she had declined to have with Aegon's ravens. Dorne's memory of what happened to Rhaenys runs through everything the series shows of the Martell family 3 centuries later. When Oberyn Martell comes to King's Landing for Tyrion's trial, and reveals that what he actually wants is to speak with Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, the man who was Tywin Lannister's instrument for the killing of Elia Martell and her children, he is acting from a wound that has been carried in the Martell family for 300 years. Elia Martell's death mirrors Rhaenys's in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if history had decided to repeat the same lesson for anyone who had not absorbed it the first time. Dorne submits eventually, but it does not forget. It submits, and it waits, and it keeps its accounts with the precision of a family that understands that the balance will eventually need to be settled. Ellaria Sand's decision to poison Myrcella Baratheon, a child sent to Dorne as a hostage to goodwill, an innocent in the calculation, someone who had nothing to do with the events that produced Ellaria's grief, is the Dornish wound expressing itself in its most destructive form. It is grief that has run past the boundaries of its legitimate target. It is the burning of the tongue, reproduced in poison, personal anguish turned into policy, achieving the opposite of its intention, making everything worse. The parallel between Visenya burning the Torrentine and Ellaria poisoning Myrcella is not accidental. George Martin is a writer who understands that patterns repeat, and that the patterns that repeat most insistently are the ones that grief produces when it is given power and denied resolution. Dorne began in loss. Dorne has never stopped being shaped by it. Let the desert settle into quiet in your mind, the red rock and the pale sand and the dry wind that smells of heat and mineral and distance. Let Rhaenys' fate remain what it is, uncertain, unresolved, the kind of historical sorrow that does not have a clean ending because it did not have a clean ending. Some wounds in history stay open. They stay open because no one who could close them chose to close them, or because the closing was made impossible by pride or by grief, or by the logic of a conflict that had run too long to remember its own beginnings. Dorne was Aegon's wound. He ruled for 37 years after the main conquest, and Dorne was always there, always in the south, always unsubmitted, always the one thing his dragons could not solve. Sleep well. The desert is patient, the night is long, and some questions are answered only by the generations that come after. But from the Dornish wound, something else emerged, something that Aegon had not originally planned. A physical object that would outlast the dynasty itself, and become the most recognizable symbol in the history of Westeros. Aegon went home to his forge, and what he built from the swords of his defeated enemies would define what it meant to rule for 300 years. Your breathing is slow and even. You are somewhere warm and held, and the night around you is quiet, and there is nothing that needs your attention until morning. We have come a long way together through the history of the Conquest, from the cold of Dragonstone and the dream that shaped everything, through the burning field and the kneeling kings and the child who asked to ride a dragon, and the wound that Dorne left in the dynasty's southern border. What remains now, before the final accounting, is the most enduring physical object the Conquest produced. Not a city, not an institution, not a treaty, but a throne. The Iron Throne. The thing every character in the series wants or fears or is shaped by, or eventually sits on and finds uncomfortable in ways that go past the literal. It deserves a careful look, in the quiet of tonight, at how it came to be, and what it was actually designed to mean. Aegon had it built, the chronicles tell us, from the swords of the lords who had submitted to his authority. The defeated, the surrendered, the kings who had bent the knee, and the lords who had ridden into his camp with their fealty and their family's future arranged neatly in the formality of an oath. They had given up their swords as part of the ceremony, or their swords had been taken, or the swords had been surrendered in the specific way that weapons surrender in the aftermath of battles that end dynasties. Aegon gathered 1,000 of these swords. Some accounts say more. And he used Balerion's fire, the fire that had melted Harrenhal's towers, that had burned the field of fire into the place name it would carry forever, to fuse them together into a seat of governance. He did this deliberately, with the specific intention of making a throne, and he made the throne look exactly like what it was, a mass of blades. The Iron Throne is ugly. This is a fact that the series acknowledges and that the histories are honest about. It is not beautiful in the way that thrones are usually meant to be beautiful, not a statement of aesthetic refinement or a celebration of the craftsman's art. It is a tangle of metal, asymmetrical and angular and sharp, rising from a base of fused steel in a shape that is only approximately chair-like, studded with points and edges that extend in every direction without apparent design. It has no back in the conventional sense. What serves as a back is a mass of blades rising above the seat in a way that makes resting against it inadvisable. The armrests are swords. The steps that lead up to it are themselves jagged, and the act of ascending to the seat is an act that requires care and attention. It sits in the throne room of the Red Keep, beneath 7 lancet windows, arranged to catch the light at the angle that makes the metal gleam most impressively. And even in that prepared light, in the best presentation available to it, it looks like a weapon rather than a piece of furniture. This was intentional. Aegon understood exactly what he was doing when he chose this form for the seat of authority, and the understanding runs through everything the throne subsequently became in the political culture of Westeros. He reportedly said, though the attribution is disputed in the way that all reported speech from this period is disputed, that a king should never sit easy. The throne was not meant to be comfortable. Comfort was not the point of sitting on it. The point of sitting on it was to be reminded, with every hour of occupation, of what it had cost to build, and what it would cost to keep, and what it meant that you were sitting in it, rather than being one of the people whose sword had been used to make it. The throne was a meditation on the relationship between power and the violence on which power rests, made into an object and placed in the center of the most important room in the realm, where no one who entered the room could look at the king without seeing behind him the 1,000 blades from which his authority had been constructed. The throne room itself is a piece of theatre as carefully designed as the throne. The 7 windows that illuminate it from the west are arranged to pour light onto the throne at the late afternoon angle, when the metal gleams most intensely, which means that the most impressive audiences are those held in the afternoon, and the throne is at its most visually powerful when the day is waning, when the business of governance is drawing toward its close, and the formality of the audience is most acutely felt. The great hall stretches from the double doors to the throne with a length calibrated to make the approach feel weighty, not so long that it becomes absurd, but long enough that the petitioner has time to feel the distance, to feel the eyes of the courtiers and the guards and the lords ranged along the walls, to feel what it means to walk toward that seat of terrible authority and ask it for something. Every court is theatre. The Iron Throne's theatre was designed by a man who understood that political authority has a visual grammar. And who wrote that grammar in steel and light? Sit with the image of the throne for a moment, as you breathe slowly in the dark. 1,000 swords fused by dragon fire into a seat. The swords belonged to people who had submitted, who had calculated and survived, or been defeated and survived, or simply recognized what was happening and chosen the path that preserved their families and their futures. The throne was built from the weapons of their submission. It was made from the proof that they had been willing to keep fighting but had chosen not to. And it was placed in the center of the realm's power as a daily reminder of that willingness, their willingness, and the cost at which it had been purchased. The king who sat on it was surrounded by blades. He was, in the most literal sense available, in the middle of 1,000 swords that could cut him. The throne cut every king who sat on it carelessly, and the chronicles note this as a persistent fact of the Targaryen dynasty. The throne drew blood. It cut the unwary. It nicked the confident and wounded the complacent. It was, in this, an accurate metaphor for what it represented. There is a philosophy embedded in the design of the Iron Throne that Aegon never explicitly articulated, but that is legible in every choice he made in its construction. Power is not given. It is not inherited, not really, not in any sense that matters without the force to back it. Power is taken and maintained through the continuous demonstration of the capacity to take it, and the throne is a reminder of exactly this. Not a comfortable seat from which to dispense wisdom, but a tangle of blades from which to govern a world that has not forgotten, and must not be allowed to forget, that the blades are real. This is not a romantic view of governance. It is a deeply honest one, and it is the view that 300 years of Targaryen rule tended to confirm, in the specific way that things that are true tend to be confirmed by long experience. What makes the throne philosophically interesting, and what gives it its persistent power as a symbol, beyond the obvious and blunt visual statement it makes, is the relationship it establishes between the king and the 1,000 lords whose swords made it. The king sits among their blades. He is enclosed by their submission. But their submission is made of their blades, which means that their capacity for violence, the violence they chose not to exercise, is literally the structure of his seat. He rests on what they gave up. He is surrounded by what they might have used against him. This is the nature of political authority expressed as furniture. The ruler is always, in some sense, sitting in the middle of the weapons of those he rules, and his security depends on those weapons remaining in the configuration they were placed in, rather than returning to the hands that made them. The chronicles note that Balerion spent 2 weeks fusing the swords. This is not the way you forge metal with conventional fire. The work of heating and bending and fusing 1,000 blades into a single coherent structure, even a roughly coherent structure, would require sustained application of heat at temperatures that only dragonfire could reliably produce. Balerion was, by this point in the Conquest, already more than a century old, the oldest living thing in Westeros, the last creature to have seen old Valyria while it still stood, a creature whose lifespan was already legendary, and whose eventual death would be mourned in a way that the deaths of kings rarely are. He worked on the throne for 2 weeks, his black fire turning the edges of the surrendered swords to something between metal and mineral, fusing them in the specific way that heat beyond a certain threshold fuses things, not melting them entirely into a formless mass, but joining them at their edges, preserving their individual shapes while making them inseparable. The throne is recognizably made of swords because Balerion was precise. A less precise application of that much heat would have produced a puddle. The specific swords included in the throne are the subject of an enormous amount of historical speculation and very little hard evidence. Loren Lannister's sword, almost certainly. Swords from the Reach Lords who had knelt at the Field of Fire, or shortly after. Swords from the River Lords who had submitted first, and from the Lords who had submitted last. Not Torrhen Stark's sword. Torrhen bent the knee and gave his crown, but the North swords remained in northern hands, which was part of the specific arrangement of the northern submission, and reflects Aegon's careful attention to what each vassal needed to feel that the terms of their submission were bearable. The Arryn swords, presumably, though the Vale's submission was so smooth that the details of what was surrendered tend to be lost in the general pleasure of the story's resolution. And possibly from the houses whose names are not recorded, from lords too small to be remembered individually, but whose swords collectively made up the mass of the throne, the unnamed, the unchronicled, the people whose contribution to the physical seat of Westerosi authority is preserved only in the metal that surrounds a king's seat. Every character in the series who encounters the Iron Throne has a response that tells you exactly who they are and what they understand about power. Robert Baratheon, who had defeated Rhaegar at the Trident and taken the throne by right of conquest, in the only sense that Aegon himself would have recognized as legitimate, hated it. He was not a man for sitting still, not a man for the patient endurance of petitions and court ceremony that the throne demands, not a man built for the specific kind of governance that requires remaining in one uncomfortable chair for long hours while the realm's business processes through you. He spent his reign hunting and drinking and producing an enormous number of bastard children, and leaving the actual work of governance to whoever was willing to do it. The throne cut him. Not literally. Robert was too large and too careful in his movements to be cut by a blade he was aware of, but in the sense that the mismatch between what he was and what the throne required of him produced a reign of progressive dysfunction. He won the throne. He could not become the person the throne needed him to be. Cersei's relationship to the Iron Throne is the series' most extended meditation on what the throne meant and what it cost. She wanted it with a specifically personal ferocity that went past political ambition into something closer to hunger. And she sat on it, briefly, at moments of crisis when the king was absent and the queen regent was the highest authority present. She understood its visual language better than anyone in the modern series, and she dressed herself in its language deliberately. The gold and the red, the queenly gravity, the awareness of being watched. But the throne was not designed for her, in the specific sense that it was designed by a man who believed that the person who sat on it should be the person with the most capacity for force in the realm, and in Westeros as it existed, that person was always going to be defined in terms that excluded her. She built her own authority through other means. The throne was where she wanted to sit. It was never entirely hers. It cut her, too, in its way. Daenerys Targaryen touches the Iron Throne in the ruins of the Red Keep and finds it cold. It is the last thing she does before Jon Snow makes his decision. She has burned the city. She has killed the people the throne was supposed to protect. She has arrived at the seat her ancestor built, and it is cold, and the room is full of ash, and there is nothing in that moment that resembles the completion of a dream. The throne was built from the weapons of submission. The city around it was built from the labor of people who were supposed to benefit from that submission, who were supposed to be safer and more prosperous for being subjects of a unified realm, rather than the pawns of 7 competing kingdoms. Daenerys has burned them. She has burned the justification for the throne while standing in front of the throne. Whatever she touches when she touches it in that moment is not the dream. It is the thing the dream was supposed to prevent. Let the throne rest in the dark of your mind, not as a dramatic image, but as a quiet one. A tangle of blades in an empty room, cold and still, holding in its structure the memory of the 1,000 hands that surrendered the swords that made it. It was there before the series began. It will be there after the series ends, or its absence will mark the place where it was. Aegon built it to last. He built it as an argument made in metal, an argument about power and submission, and the cost of governance, and the continuous presence of force beneath the surface of political authority. The argument is still being made. The swords are still fused. Sleep well. The throne is patient. It has always been patient. It was built by the most patient fire the world has produced, and it holds in its cold metal edges all the time in the world. And now, at last, we arrive at the final accounting. The dynasty that began on a cold island with a dream and a prophecy and 3 dragons. What it built, what it cost, what it could not solve, and what it passed on to be solved by the people who came after. The Targaryens are behind us. The long inheritance is ahead. You have come a long way tonight. Let that be something you hold gently, not as an achievement requiring attention, but as a simple fact. like the warmth of wherever you are resting. You have travelled from a cold island and a dream about the end of the world, through fire and kneeling kings and a child's wonder and a desert wound that would never quite close, through a throne built from surrendered swords and a city built from a practical decision on a muddy riverbank. We arrive now at the final question. What did all of it add up to? What was the Targaryen conquest in the long view that only the end of a dynasty can provide? What did Aegon build, and what did it cost? And did the dream that drove him turn out to be true? Aegon the Conqueror reigned for 37 years after the conquest was substantially complete. He was not, in those 37 years, a happy man, or at least the accounts that survive paint the picture of someone who had achieved everything he set out to achieve, and found that achievement was a different thing from peace. The Dornish wound never healed. Rhaenys was never returned. He ruled the realm he had built, administered the institutions he had designed, received the reports of the small council, and the hand with the attention of a man who understood that governance was the real work, and conquest was only the beginning. He aged, he grew quieter. The silver-gold hair went to grey, and then to white, and the violet eyes carried what eyes carry when a person has lived with a very large sadness for a very long time. He died at Dragonstone, the island where it had all begun, as if the arc of his life needed to close in the place where it had opened. What Aegon built that lasted longest was not the throne or the city, or the Kingsguard or the small council, though all of these lasted and shaped everything that followed. What lasted longest was the idea. A single realm, a unified Westeros, a political project that insisted, against all the evidence of 12,000 years of fragmentation and mutual warfare, that the continent could be organized as one thing rather than 7 separate things. This idea was not self-evidently true when Aegon proposed it. It had never been tried. The Valyrian freehold had never extended this far west. The previous periods of Westerosi history had produced only temporary hegemonies, powerful kingdoms that dominated their neighbours for a generation or two before the cycle of conflict reset. What Aegon built was different, genuinely different in kind, not merely in scale. He built institutions that outlasted him, that could be operated by successors who were his inferiors in vision and capability, that had enough structural strength to survive the ordinary dysfunction of dynastic governance. The Targaryen dynasty lasted for nearly 300 years. In the long view of political history, this is neither short nor especially long. What makes it remarkable is that it achieved the thing it was built to achieve. It maintained the unity of Westeros across 3 centuries of successors who ranged from the genuinely capable to the genuinely catastrophic. The Mad King Aerys was the second worst possible outcome for the Iron Throne. A man whose paranoia and cruelty made the realm ungovernable, and who ended the dynasty in the most complete way available, by producing a rebellion so broad and so motivated that no existing institution could survive it. And yet, even after the Targaryens fell, the realm they had built persisted. The 7 kingdoms remained one. The institutions remained functional. The hand of the king still ran the government, the small council still met, the Iron Throne still stood in the throne room, cold and patient, waiting for whoever the next occupant would be. The dynasty ended, the structure endured, the dragons diminished. This is perhaps the most melancholy fact of the long inheritance, and the one that most directly connects the founding moment to the eventual collapse. Balerion died in the reign of Aegon's grandson. Vhagar lasted considerably longer, passed through several riders, and eventually died in the Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryen civil war that consumed most of the remaining dragons in a generation of fratricidal conflict. By the time of the later Targaryen kings, the dragons were gone. Not dramatically gone, not killed in a final battle, but gradually gone. Smaller with each generation, fewer with each decade, until the last one died and the Targaryens were left with a claim to divine favour and a dynasty's worth of mythology built on creatures that no longer existed. They kept the eggs. They kept the custom of sleeping with dragon eggs in their cradles, hoping to hatch new ones. None hatched. The eggs went cold. The Targaryens went on ruling, dragonless, supported by the reputation of what they had once had rather than the reality of what they currently possessed. Sit with that for a long, quiet moment. The Targaryens without dragons are, in the most fundamental sense, a different proposition from the Targaryens with them. The conquest was only possible because of the dragons. The early dynasty was stable because of the dragons, because the memory of what 3 dragons could do on a summer afternoon was fresh enough to make resistance feel like suicide, because the dragons were present and visible and terrifying in the specific way that potential force is terrifying even when it is not being used. When the dragons died, what remained was the tradition and the institution and the mythology, and these things are powerful, but they are not dragons. They can be argued with. They can be resisted. They can be gradually eroded by a series of weak kings and poor decisions until the moment when someone looks at the throne and calculates that the cost of taking it is lower than the cost of submitting to whoever sits on it. That moment arrived, eventually. Robert Baratheon at the Trident, and a dynasty that had lasted 300 years, ended in an afternoon at a river crossing. The ending rhymes with the beginning in ways that feel almost designed. It ended at the Trident, the same river where Torrhen Stark had crossed to submit 300 years earlier, the river at the center of the continent where the water flows in every direction. It ended with a personal combat, Rhaegar versus Robert, the last Targaryen who might have saved the dynasty against the man who had found the next one, settled between 2 individuals rather than between 2 armies, in the most ancient possible resolution of a question about who should rule. It ended because the dynasty had stopped maintaining the one thing that made it viable as a governing arrangement, the loyalty of enough of the realm's lords to make rebellion too costly to contemplate. When enough of them decided that the cost of rebellion was lower than the cost of continuing, when Tywin Lannister sacked King's Landing and the Starks marched south and the Baratheons and the Tullys joined the cause, the dynasty's structural vulnerability was simply exposed. It had been there for a generation. The Mad King had created it. Robert Baratheon walked through the door it had opened. And then, 3 centuries after the conquest, a young woman stood on the shore of Dragonstone with 3 newly hatched dragons and looked west at a continent she believed was hers. And the dream began again. Daenerys Targaryen was everything the dynasty had built toward and everything it had failed to prevent. She had the dragons that the later Targaryens had lost. She had the vision and the certainty and the absolute sense of purpose that Aegon himself had carried across the narrow sea. She had in her blood the 3-century accumulation of the dynasty's mythology and self-understanding. And she had in her history every wound that the dynasty had inflicted and every wound that had been inflicted on it, the sorrow of exile and loss, and the specific kind of damage that is done to a person who is told, from their earliest memory, that they are the rightful heir to something enormous that has been stolen from them. The Song of Ice and Fire, as a prophecy, turned out to be both true and more complicated than Aegon had understood it. The long night did come, or rather, what came was clearly the thing the long night had always threatened. The dead walking south, the Night King with his army of cold, the wall coming down, and everything that Aegon had built his unified realm to stand against finally, after 12,000 years, making its appearance. And the unified realm responded, not as Aegon had necessarily envisioned, not as a single coordinated military force operating under a clear chain of command, but as a coalition of battered survivors who had found their way to Winterfell through the specifically human combination of rivalry and necessity. And the last-minute recognition, that certain things matter more than the disputes that had organized their lives up to that point. The long night came. It was survived. The dead were sent back. The specific person who ended the long night was not the Targaryen heir. It was Arya Stark, a daughter of the North, carrying in her blood the 8,000-year continuity of the first men who had built the wall in the first place, who had made the pact with the children of the forest, that had created the Night King as a weapon against the first men, and then lost control of what they had made. Arya Stark killed the Night King with a blade that had passed through the hands of Littlefinger and Bran Stark and Jon Snow before reaching her, a Valyrian steel knife that had been used in an assassination attempt against her brother, that had moved through the hands of the living toward the moment when it would be used against the dead. The weapon that killed the Night King was Valyrian steel. The hand that used it was Stark. The prophecy was larger than any single bloodline. It was always going to require the full inheritance of Westeros, everything that the Conquest had assembled, all of it together, to answer. Jon Snow's choice, the choice to kill Daenerys after she has burned King's Landing, the choice that ends the dynasty and resolves the question of the Iron Throne by breaking the throne's power to organize the political future of Westeros, is the Conquest's final act. Aegon built a unified realm because he believed unity was necessary for survival. Jon Snow, looking at the ash of King's Landing and the woman who burned it, makes a different calculation. That the specific unity Aegon built has become the obstacle rather than the answer. That the tool Aegon designed for the purpose of saving the world has become, in the hands of the person who was supposed to fulfill the prophecy, something the world needs to be saved from. He acts. It costs him everything he is and everyone he loves. And what comes after? The Great Council, the selection of Bran Stark as king, the dissolution of the hereditary principle in favor of something closer to election, is not what Aegon built. But it might be what Aegon, in his deepest understanding of what the realm actually needed, would have recognized as correct. The bittersweet quality of the Targaryen legacy is the quality that runs through the entire history of the Conquest, once you know how the story ends. Aegon was right that the realm needed to be unified. He was right that a long night was coming. He was right that the wall needed to be maintained, and the Night's Watch honored, and the ancient treaties with the Dark taken seriously. He was right about all of the important things, in the large sense that vision operates when it is genuinely prophetic rather than simply ambitious. And yet the dynasty he founded also produced Aerys the Mad King, and the Dance of the Dragons, and the War of the Usurper, and 100 years of variable quality governance that ended in the burning of the very city he had built. The dream was true. The institution built to protect the dream was imperfect. This is the specific tragedy of the Targaryen story, and it is the kind of tragedy that has the texture of genuine history rather than of simple cautionary tale. Not that the dream was false, but that even a true dream, built into institutions and dynasties and thrones made from surrendered swords, acquires, over 3 centuries, the ordinary vulnerabilities of everything that human beings build. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. What endures, in the end, is not the throne, which is ultimately destroyed, its political function dissolved by the Great Council that Tyrion convenes in the ash of the conquered capital. What endures is the realm itself, the single Westeros that Aegon assembled from 7 kingdoms over the course of 2 years and 37 years of subsequent governance. It endures as 6 independent kingdoms plus the North, which recovers its independence in the settlement that Sansa Stark negotiates, Torrhen's 300-year-old wound finally closing in the way that wounds close when the person with the right to ask for what they need finally asks. The realm is not what Aegon built, but it is built on what Aegon built. Every stone of every castle, every institutional habit, every understanding of what Westerosi governance means, all of it carries, somewhere in its foundation, the print of the landing on the Blackwater rush, the wooden fort on the muddy hill, the 3 dragons circling overhead, and a 27-year-old man with silver gold hair and a very specific dream about the end of the world. Let the history soften now, at the edges of your awareness, becoming impression rather than information. The names can blur together. The dates can dissolve. What remains, as you breathe slowly in the dark and let the night complete its quiet work, is something simpler. The image of a young man standing on the shore of an island in a cold sea, looking west, carrying a dream that was larger than he was and that he spent his entire life trying to make real. He made it real. The cost was enormous. The result was imperfect. The world was different because of what he did. Different in ways that cascaded through 3 centuries and ended in fire and a great council and a broken throne and a wolf walking home through the deep north, past the wall, into the permanent cold where the deep past lives. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep, as it always keeps, patient and enormous and indifferent to our need to finish understanding it before we sleep. Everything you've heard tonight will still be true in the morning. Aegon will still have crossed. The field of fire will still have burned. Torrhen Stark will still have knelt. The child will still have ridden the dragon. The Dornish wound will still be open, and the throne will still be cold. And somewhere in the deep north, the memory of a long night will still be preserved in the oldest trees, in the blood-red leaves and the carved faces of weirwoods that watched it all and said nothing and remember everything. Your watch for tonight is ended. Sleep well. The dream was real, and you were always part of it. And if any part of tonight's history stayed with you, if there was a moment that surprised you, or a thread you want to follow further, leave it in the comments below. We read them all, in our own candlelit archive, and the questions you ask are often the questions that become the next journey. Until then, rest well, traveller. The Meister keeps watch.